Hello everyone, welcome back to another scary story. Your place where we uncover the darkest mysteries in a calming and reflective way. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. Now get comfortable and relax. I hadn't planned on stopping anywhere. The job interview was downtown at 4:30 sharp, and if traffic stayed chill, I could make it with a little time to spare. But my stomach had other ideas. I'd skipped lunch, nerves already eating, at me, and all I'd had was a gas station coffee that tasted like burnt tires. That's how I ended up pulling into the faded parking lot of a Burger King off Sunset. One of those sad, slightly damp-looking locations that felt like they hadn't been updated since 1999. Silver Lake had its charm, sure. Cool record shops, overpriced donuts, that whole retro hipster thing. But this BK was a ghost of corporate dreams past. Rusted signage, cracked pavement, a busted drive-through speaker that just looped static. And still the whiff of cheap grease called to me. Grease and desperation. The sky hung low, thick with clouds the color of dirty dishwater. One of those LA days where you don't know if it's going to rain or just mope forever. I parked my car and hesitated a second. The windows were all steamed over from the inside, which should have been my first clue. Second clue. The stench hit me the second I cracked the door. Not the usual fast food perfume. No, this was different. Wet dog. Sour milk and something sharp underneath like bleach and BO. It punched me in the nose. I gagged and almost turned around, but I was already halfway through the door. Besides, I figured I'd be in and out in 5 minutes. A burger, some fries, and back on the road. Big mistake. Inside, the lights buzzed like angry flies. The place was dead quiet except for the hum of the soda machine and the weird squelch of something wet being lapped up off the floor. That's when I saw her. Hunched over by the fountain drinks like a troll in a sweat-stained pink tracksuit. Hair a tangled bird's nest. Her back to me, but I could already smell the booze. And crouched beside her, God help me, was the biggest damn Rottweiler I'd ever seen. Its tongue slopped around a puddle of what I realized was spilled root beer, licking it up like it was blood. I leaned toward the counter and muttered, "Jesus, it smells like a kennel in here." And just like that, my whole day turned to hell. The moment I spoke, I regretted it. I wasn't even trying to be loud, just a grumble under my breath to the kid behind the register. But somehow, she heard me, like a dog perking up at the sound of a treat bag. Her head whipped around so fast it made me flinch, her eyes, bloodshot, watery, framed by smeared mascara, locked on me like heat-seeking missiles. "You got a problem, pretty boy?" she barked. The way she said it made my skin crawl. Her voice was gravelly, coated with years of cigarettes and cheap vodka. I noticed then that she wasn't just feeding the dog. She'd actually poured the root beer onto the floor for him, like that was normal. I tried to ignore her, act cool, just turned back to the cashier, this twitchy teenager who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. His name tag said Jake. He gave me this half-hearted shrug like, "Yeah, this is just Tuesday here." Then it happened. I didn't even see it coming. One second I was looking down at the menu, the next a sticky splat. Something wet hit me dead center in the chest. I looked down. Brown liquid soaked through my shirt and tie. Sticky. Cold. She'd thrown her cup at me. "What the hell?" I shouted, backing up. Marla staggered upright, laughing like a busted air horn. "That's what you get for running your mouth, Hollywood," she slurred. Her dog started barking, wild and sharp, the kind of bark that cuts through bone, deep-chested, violent. Then came the words, "I'll never forget. Tear him up, Brutus." That's when the leash snapped. I swear to God, it sounded like a gun going off. The leather strap just popped and curled into the air like a dead snake. Brutus lunged, forward, paws thundering across the greasy tile. I caught a flash of yellowed teeth and red gums, his jowls flapping as he snarled. Pure terror kicked in. My brain went blank. I didn't think. I just ran. I vaulted over the low counter like a goddamn action hero, except less cool and more desperate. My knees smacked the edge and I face-planted behind the register, hard in my throat. I could hear the dog's claws scratching across the floor, trying to grip the tile. Jake screamed, "I'm calling the cops, lady. Get your demon dog out of here." The kid was practically crying, trying to unlock his phone with shaky fingers. I pressed myself against the soda machine, praying the dog wouldn't come around the side. Marla just laughed again, that nasty hacking wheeze. "You little girls better toughen up. Brutus just wants to say hi." The hell he did. Then I saw his face. Brutus, that is. He was pacing in the open, panting and drooling, eyes locked on me like I was a steak on a plate, the glass between us fogged up from his breath. I thought that was it. My obituary would read, "Freelancer mauled at Burger King was wearing a clip-on tie." Then came the sound that saved my life. Sirens. Marla's expression changed instantly, from amused to panicked. She grabbed Brutus by the collar, more like wrestled him, and hauled him toward the door. "Come on, baby, come on," she kept muttering. "They ain't taking you away again." And just like that, they vanished into the gray afternoon mist. I lay there behind the counter, soaked in soda and cold sweat, my pulse still thumping like a drum in my ears. Jake offered me a handful of napkins with a shaking hand. "You okay, man?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. But inside I knew one thing for sure. I was never going back to that Burger King again. I stayed behind the counter for a good 2 minutes after she left, just trying to get my breathing under control. You know how people talk about being in shock? That weird floaty feeling where your hands don't feel like yours and your ears are ringing? That was me. Covered in root beer, heart hammering, trying not to puke. The sirens were louder now. Flashing red and blue lights pulsed through the greasy windows. A cruiser screeched into the lot, brakes squealing, followed by another. Jake let out a shaky breath. "They're here. No shit." 2 officers came in fast, one hand on his holster, the other scanning the room like this might still be an active situation. The smell must have hit them instantly, too. The shorter cop, a guy with a buzz cut and a thick mustache, wrinkled his nose and asked, "Where's the woman with the dog?" "Gone," Jake said. "She took off like 10 seconds before you got here. She sicked a dog on me." I muttered from behind the counter, finally standing up. My legs wobbled. They took our statements, asked what direction she ran, checked the security footage. Nothing groundbreaking. Just more of the same. Marla screaming, Brutus charging, me diving like a maniac. They said they'd put out a report, that animal control was already familiar with her. "Wait, so she's done this before?" I asked. Buzzcut nodded grimly. "Yeah. We've had a couple complaints over the last year. Usually she's just yelling at people on the sidewalk, but the dog's bitten someone before. Animal control's been trying to catch her and Brutus for a while now." I stared at him. "Why hasn't she been arrested?" He sighed. "Mental illness. No fixed address. Slippery as hell. She always disappears before we get there." Jake offered me a Sprite and an extra Whopper. I said no to both. My appetite had evaporated the moment the root beer hit my chest. I checked my phone. 4:04 p.m. Shit, my interview. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. Shirt stained, tie ruined, eyes wide, pale as a ghost. I splashed water on my face, did my best to clean up, but nothing could fix the smell. I still stank, like wet dog and sugar syrup. Still, I showed up. I didn't want to let one psycho ruin my shot at getting back on my feet. The office was sleek, all glass walls and fake plants. I walked in like I hadn't just survived a fast food horror show. I could tell the woman interviewing me was trying not to look at the stain on my collar. "Rough day?" she asked, half joking. "You have no idea," I said. And then I told her. The whole thing. She stared, eyes wide. And then somehow, she laughed. "Well," she said, flipping through my resume, At least you know how to handle chaos. That's kind of what this job is. I got the job, against all odds. But the next day, when my stomach rumbled around lunchtime, I drove right past 3 different Burger Kings without a second glance. No fries, no Whopper. Just this weird twist in my gut every time I saw that red crown. Some things stick with you. It took a few days for my nerves to settle. I thought once I got through the interview and secured the job, I'd be able to just brush it off, chalk it up to another weird LA moment and move on. But that's not how trauma works, apparently. The first night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing claws on tile in my head over and over. I'd close my eyes and there it was, Brutus's face charging at me, jowls swinging, teeth slick. I'd jolt awake, soaked in sweat, heart pounding. Then I'd lay there, breathing like I just ran a mile, staring at the ceiling until the sun started rising. The second night I dreamt I was trapped in that Burger King again. Except it wasn't really a Burger King anymore. It was darker, older, like something out of a nightmare. The walls were rotting. The soda machine hissed like a snake, and I could hear Marla's laugh echoing from the bathroom. Brutus paced in the kitchen, waiting for me. I woke up in a cold sweat, convinced I'd heard a growl coming from the hallway. By the end of the week, I started double-checking my locks. I told myself it was stupid. She didn't know who I was, didn't know where I lived. But that didn't stop me from sliding the deadbolt twice and bracing a chair under the doorknob. It all might have started to fade. If not for the jogger. It was Friday morning. I was still adjusting to the new job. Decent gig at a small content firm. Nothing flashy, but stable. I had a coffee in hand, scrolling the news on my phone while the elevator crept up to the office. And then I saw the headline, "Jogger mauled in Silver Lake. Dog still at large." I clicked. There wasn't much detail yet. Just a blurry shot of police tape near a running trail and a quote from a neighbor who heard screaming and barking around 6 a.m. But then came the witness description. A large black dog. Looked like a Rottweiler. No leash. Looked wild. My stomach turned. It had to be Brutus. There was no way it wasn't. That night, I texted Jake, the kid from Burger King, using the number he'd given me after the incident. Just in case either of us needed to talk to the cops. You see the news? Yeah, that was him. Had to be. We didn't say much after that. I don't know why I suddenly felt responsible. Maybe because I lived. Maybe because I got away and someone else didn't. Later that week, I drove past that Burger King again, just to see the doors were shuttered, windows papered over. A weathered sign taped to the door said, "Closed for maintenance, reopening TBD." But the lot wasn't empty. There was a dark smear on the sidewalk near the soda machine window. Could have been old oil. Could have been something else. And I could have sworn, as I sat in my car watching the wind ripple through the trees, I heard it again. Low. Deep. A growl. A month passed. Then 2. I got used to my new job. Found a rhythm. The night sweats stopped. Mostly. Some mornings I still woke up tense, like my body was bracing for impact. But I figured that was just life in LA after 30. Stress, bills, traffic. Nothing supernatural. Still, I avoided Sunset Boulevard. Didn't matter that my commute passed right by that old Burger King. I took the longer route, even if it meant 20 extra minutes in bumper-to-bumper hell. I couldn't even say it was a conscious choice. It just happened. Like muscle memory pulling me away from something I hadn't quite processed yet. One Friday, Jake texted me out of nowhere. They tore it down. I stared at the message, half expecting a follow-up. Burger King, gone. He sent a photo next. Just rubble and rebar. Some faded signage being hauled away in a flatbed truck. The building looked half chewed, like time had finally gotten tired of pretending it didn't want the place gone. "You ever go back?" I asked. Once. Before they closed. It just felt wrong. Smelled worse than before. No customers. Just me and a homeless guy in the back booth. I didn't eat. I didn't reply. The thing was, I had gone back too. Once. About a week after the jogger attack, I parked in the lot late at night. Just sat there with the engine off. The store was already closed by then, but something drew me there. Maybe I needed proof it was real. Maybe I was chasing closure. I don't know. But here's the weird part. It still smelled like root beer, faint, almost like a trick of memory. But it was there. That sour, sweet scent mixed with dog musk and fryer grease. I got out of the car, walked to the door, looked inside. Everything was still, abandoned. One fluorescent light flickered inside. The soda machine was unplugged, but there was a dark stain where it had leaked, dried into the tile like an old bruise. That was enough for me. I turned and left. A few weeks later, I heard a guy on Reddit spinning the story like it was some urban legend. The haunted Burger King of Silver Lake said if you went there after midnight, you could still hear a dog barking and the sound of soda splashing onto tile. Said the dog had red eyes. Said Marla vanished into the storm drains. People always gotta dress things up. Make it cinematic. The truth? It was just a broken woman and a dangerous dog. Nothing supernatural. Nothing paranormal. Just the kind of everyday horror that slips past you when you're not paying attention, but that doesn't make it any less real. I still see Brutus sometimes, in dreams, in random flashes when I walk into a quiet building and hear a weird echo. And every so often when I'm grabbing lunch and reach for a soda, I hesitate. Something in me flinches at the sound of a cup filling. Funny, right? A dog, a woman, a bad day. That's all it was. But I swear, the smell never left. I didn't believe in ghosts when I moved into 1428 Blackwood Lane. Honestly, I still don't know if I do. But something happened in that house. Something I can't explain. Something that made me stop laughing at ghost stories. The house had that old New England look. All angles and shadows, Victorian bones sagging under decades of snow and silence. It was tucked into a quiet corner of Ravenshade, Vermont, surrounded by skeletal trees and brittle brown grass. Locals called it the Blackwood House, after the family that owned the textile mill back when the town actually had jobs. That place had shut down years before we moved in. Its brick smokestack still loomed over the hills like gravestones. The rent was dirt cheap, and that should have been a red flag. 3 of us, me, Mia, and Ryan, all fresh hires at a tech startup, trying to gentrify Ravenshade with co-working spaces and cold brew on tap. We didn't care about ghost stories or local legends. We cared about Wi-Fi speed, door locks, and whether the shower had decent pressure. The day we moved in, it was cold enough to see our breath inside. The landlord, some wiry guy named Calvin who smelled like chewing tobacco and mothballs, met us on the porch. He handed us one set of keys and barely looked us in the eye. "She's old," he muttered. "Don't go messing with the basement. Furnace down there's finicky. Pipes rattle. Just let it be." We nodded, not really listening. Basement, or not, we had laptops to plug in and IKEA furniture to assemble. The inside of the house wasn't awful, just tired. Peeling wallpaper, creaky floors, the kind of smell you only get from a century of trapped dust. The living room had a fireplace no one trusted, a dusty piano in the corner, and a draft that seemed to come from nowhere. Our rooms were upstairs. I took the one in the back, big window, view of the woods. Mia, always the artsy type, picked the room with the slanted ceiling and the antique vanity. Ryan didn't care. He just wanted to set up his rig and get back to coding. The basement? None of us were eager to hang out down there. The door was off the kitchen, tucked behind a warped wooden panel. When I opened it the first time, a wave of damp air rolled out like a warning. I clicked on the bulb, one of those pull-string deals, and it flickered to life. Stairs descended into murky concrete and rusted pipes. It smelled like mold and something else, like meat left out too long. We stored our junk down there, holiday decorations, old boxes from college, tools we never used. We didn't think much of it. Just a basement, right? Still, I never liked going down there alone. Even then, on that first day, something about the way the shadows pooled in the corners made my neck itch. It wasn't just dark, it felt heavy. Like the air thickened the deeper you went. We joked about it, of course. Bet Blackwood kept his creepy taxidermy down there, Mia said, rolling her eyes. Ryan chimed in. That's where the unpaid interns go when they miss deadlines. I laughed. We all did. But none of us stayed down there longer than we had to. Later that night, I asked Calvin about the house's history, just to make conversation. He paused mid-chew of sunflower seeds and said, Used to be Elias Blackwood's place, ran the mill back in the day, tough bastard. People say he was cruel, locked workers in the basement when they screwed up. Don't know if that's true. Anyone die down there? I asked, joking. He didn't smile. Maybe. But if they did, House swallowed it up. He left after that. And I stood on the porch, watching him disappear into the fog, feeling something I couldn't name coil low in my gut. Something about the way he said it, like the house wasn't just old. It was hungry. It started slow. So slow I almost didn't notice. The first few nights in the house, I chalked everything up to age. Old homes make noise. It's what they do. Floorboards creak, pipes groan, windows rattle when the wind cuts through the valley just right. The first time I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom, I figured it was Mia coming back from the bathroom, or maybe Ryan pacing on a late-night conference call. I didn't even get out of bed to check, but the next night it happened again just after 10:30. Not fast footsteps, not shuffling, just one step, then a pause, then another, like someone was trying not to be heard. But the hall was empty. Started paying attention, and that's when I noticed the time. 10:37 p.m. almost every night. It was like the house exhaled around then. The creak stopped, the hum of the fridge softened, the pipes went quiet. It wasn't peaceful, though. It felt hollow, like the silence itself was listening. Then there was the smell. Not all the time, just in the kitchen near the basement door. A sour, almost metallic odor, like rotting meat left in a plastic bag for too long. I scrubbed the fridge, took out the trash, checked the garbage disposal. Nothing. But the smell came back, always faint, always there when I stood too close to that warped panel where the basement door was hidden. One night, I went down there for the toolbox. The bulb above the stairs buzzed to life like it didn't want to. I stepped down, carefully, each stair moaning under my weight. It was cold, not just chilly. Cold like a walk-in freezer. I grabbed the toolbox and turned to leave when I heard it. Just one sound. A breath, low and wet, like lungs full of fluid. I froze, ears straining. Nothing. Then, from the far end of the basement, near the furnace, something shifted. Not a creak, not a draft. Something moved. I didn't wait to see what. I took the stairs two at a time and slammed the door behind me. I didn't tell Ryan or Mia that night. Ryan would have said I was overtired. Mia would have offered to cleanse the space with sage or crystals or whatever she was into that week. I needed to be sure before I dragged anyone else into my paranoia. The next few days I stayed upstairs, left the light on at night, tried to ignore how the hairs on the back of my neck stood up any time I got near the kitchen. I made excuses to work late, told myself it was just stress, just my brain catching up with the move, the new job, the cold. Then Mia came upstairs one night holding a broken ornament in her hand. Her face was pale, mouth tight. I heard something in the basement, she said. She'd gone down to get the Christmas decorations. Said she was halfway to the shelves when something scratched the wall. Not like a mouse. Louder. Slower. Like nails, she whispered. But too long. I wanted to tell her it was nothing. I wanted to be the rational one. But I remembered the breath, the smell, the shifting shadows, and I knew she wasn't lying. That night we all stayed in the living room. None of us said it out loud, but we didn't want to be alone. The TV played something none of us were really watching, and every now and then someone would glance toward the kitchen. At 10:37 p.m. the house went quiet again, and we all heard it. One slow footstep on the basement stairs. The next morning, the house was quiet, Too quiet. None of us talked about what we heard the night before. Mia stayed bundled on the couch, wrapped in a fleece blanket, thumbing through her phone like she was trying to distract herself from what she'd felt. I made breakfast but didn't eat. Every time I looked at the basement door, something in my stomach twisted, like it knew something I didn't. Ryan came downstairs wearing that same smug face he always wore when we got spooked. "So," he said, pouring himself coffee, "we're officially afraid of old wood creaking now?" "No one said we were afraid," Mia snapped without looking up. "Right. You're just both pale and jumpy for fun." I wanted to say something, to tell him what I'd heard, what I'd felt, but he wouldn't have listened. Ryan prided himself on being logical, rational. Mr. Science has an explanation for everything. It made sense. His dad had been military, his mom a nurse. Raised on rules and evidence, that's how he lived. But even logic has its limits. Later that night, the smell came back, this time stronger, almost sweet, like rotting fruit left out too long, except worse. I stood near the basement door, breathing through my sleeve, trying to figure out if we had a dead animal under the floorboards. "I'm gonna prove it's nothing," Ryan said suddenly, walking up behind me. "Wait, what?" "I'm going down there. Gonna film it. You both clearly need closure or something." "Ryan, seriously, we don't..." But he was already unlocking the door, phone light in one hand, flashlight in the other. The wood groaned as he pulled it open. The cold air that rolled out was thicker than I remembered. I swear it had weight. He stepped down, one stair, then another. Mia came into the kitchen, her face tense. "He's really doing it?" "Yeah," I said, heart pounding. Halfway down, Ryan turned and grinned up at us. "If I get eaten by ghosts, delete my browser history." We didn't laugh. He disappeared into the dark. At first it was quiet, just the occasional clatter of him bumping into stuff and mumbling under his breath. Then, silence. "Ryan?" I called. No answer. I stepped toward the stairs. Mia grabbed my wrist, her grip tight. Then his voice drifted up. "Guys, something was wrong." He sounded small, fragile. His voice had lost that cocky edge. "There's something down here." I didn't wait. I grabbed the flashlight off the counter and started down the stairs. Each step groaned like it didn't want to hold me. The flashlight cut through the dark, catching on pipes, boxes, and shadows that moved just enough to make my stomach drop. I found him near the back wall, crouched low, phone on the ground. His face was white, eyes wide like a deer cornered on a highway. "Dude, what happened?" He didn't answer. He just pointed. I followed his gaze toward the far corner. The concrete wall was damp and cracked, like something had tried to break through it. That's when I saw it. Not clearly, more like the outline of something. Wrong. Too tall. Too thin. Bent at an angle a person's body couldn't move. Long arms. One hand, or claw, I don't know, dragging slowly across the floor, leaving a faint trail in the dust. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't the dark playing tricks. I saw it, we both did. I pulled Ryan up by the arm and we ran. Not quietly, not calmly. We tripped on stairs, kicked over boxes, crashed into the door, slammed it shut. We didn't speak for a long time. When we finally looked at each other, he whispered, "I don't think that thing wants us down there." I nodded. "Then let's make sure we never go back." That night we moved the kitchen table in front of the basement door. Ryan didn't joke anymore, and none of us slept. Not really. The air in the house had changed. It wasn't just the cold that never left. Not anymore. It was like the whole place was holding its breath, as if it knew something we didn't. It felt wrong. The walls weren't just walls anymore. They felt like skin. I could almost hear them shifting at night, a faint creak or scrape like something was moving beneath them, behind them. It wasn't just the old house settling. It was something else. I couldn't sleep. None of us could. We'd gone from trying to ignore it to staying up late, keeping our lights on, avoiding the dark corners of the house. Mia was the worst. I'd catch her staring at the walls sometimes, just listening for something. Ryan was still pretending it was all in our heads. He would say stuff like, "If we ignore it, it'll go away." But he didn't seem calm anymore. He was more jittery, snapping at Mia when she jumped at shadows or when one of us flinched at a sound. It was like the fear was starting to eat him alive too. We all agreed to stay away from the basement, but the house had a way of making you feel like you couldn't escape it. Every door and window felt like it was pushing us back toward the darkness below. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was alive. One night I was sitting at the kitchen table trying to work when I heard it, something scratching, long and slow, scraping against the walls. The noise came from deep inside the house. The living room, the hallway. I froze. At first I thought it was one of us, maybe Ryan, trying to fix something or mess around. But no, it was too methodical, too deliberate. The sound was like claws, dragging across drywall, long and uneven, with a wet, horrible texture. "Ryan?" I called, my voice shaky, barely above a whisper. No answer. I stood up and walked toward the living room. Nothing, just the usual dust motes swirling in the dim light of the lamps. I checked the hallway. Still nothing. No sign of either of them. Then I heard it again, from inside the walls. I swear, I could feel the vibration in the floor, like whatever it was had claws, sharp and hungry, scraping through the insulation and the wood beams looking for a way out. It was coming from the wall behind the old couch. Just like the basement, it had that raw, fleshy feeling, like something was trying to claw its way through to the other side. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to Ryan's room, pounding on the door. "Ryan, Mia, something's in the walls." Ryan opened the door, his face bleached with exhaustion. "What the hell are you talking about?" He rubbed his eyes like he'd been up for hours. "I heard it. I felt it. Something's in the walls." He looked at me, tired and skeptical, but I could see a flicker of something behind his eyes, a flicker of the fear he'd been trying to hide. "I don't hear anything," he said, but even as he said it, I could see his eyes dart toward the wall behind me. Mia was sitting on his bed, hugging her knees to her chest. Her face was pale. She didn't say anything, but she looked at me, her eyes wide with that silent terror I knew we were all starting to feel. The thing in the basement wasn't confined to the basement anymore. It was inside the house. It was inside us. That night, we all sat in the living room, the three of us, lights on, staring at the walls, waiting. But we didn't speak. We didn't have to. The house was alive with that horrible sound now, moving beneath our feet, crawling through the walls. It wasn't a rat or a mouse or anything that could be explained. It was something bigger. I finally grabbed my phone and called the landlord. "Yeah?" His voice was thick with sleep. "Hey, there's something wrong with the house," I said. "We're hearing sounds, scratching, something inside the walls. It's been getting worse." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You're hearing it too, huh?" he said, a strange, almost resigned tone in his voice. "Wait, you know about this? Been here for 20 years, kid. Heard it all. It's nothing new. Just some old house stuff. You'll get used to it." "Used to it? This is fucked up. It's like something's trapped in the walls." He sighed. "Well, some things are better left undisturbed. Trust me, you'll get used to it." I hung up. We all stared at each other in silence. At that moment, we realized the truth. The house was feeding on our fear. It had been doing it for years. The sounds, the cold spots, the shadows in the corners, everything had been there long before we moved in. The house wasn't haunted. It was alive. And now it had us. The house had always felt off, but tonight it felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. Every creak in the floorboards, every snap of the old beams under the pressure of the night air, everything felt like it was listening. Waiting. We'd tried to act normal the past few days. like we hadn't just accepted that something horrible lived inside our walls. But that had changed. After hearing the landlord's words, we couldn't pretend anymore. The dread had become too thick, too suffocating, like we were walking through a fog of fear that never cleared. Ryan tried to go, back to work. He even said he was done with all of this ghost nonsense. But every night he came back from the office, his face grew grayer, thinner, like he was losing a battle against something inside himself. I'd catch him staring at the walls for long minutes, his jaw clenched like he could feel it crawling through the plaster just like I could. And Mia wasn't herself anymore. She was barely eating, barely sleeping. I caught her in the basement once, just standing in the dark, staring at the closed door, her eyes wide, pupils dilated, like she could hear something from the other side. I tried to convince them both that we needed to leave. We could break the lease, find somewhere else, but we were stuck in a house that had its hooks in us. We didn't know how to get out. Not physically, not mentally, not emotionally. It was like the house had become a part of us. That night, November 29th, the air was heavy with anticipation. The wind howled outside, but inside there was an unnatural stillness. At 10:37 p.m., exactly when it always started, I sat in the living room with Mia and Ryan. The lights flickered, and the temperature dropped. I could hear the deep hum of the furnace in the basement, but that wasn't what had us all on edge. No, it was the silence that had taken over the house. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. I caught Mia's eye. She was shaking, her hands fidgeting around the hem of her sweater. She was gripping it like it was the only thing holding her together. "Are you hearing that?" she whispered. I nodded. The sound was faint at first. Just a slight scrape, a soft rattle. Then, as if responding to her words, it grew louder. Nails. Long nails scratching against the inside of the walls. It started in the back corner of the house near the kitchen, where the walls met the old wooden floorboards. It was slow at first, but soon it spread to every corner, all along the walls, from the ceiling to the floor. Scrape, 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 like something trying to dig its way out. Ryan stood up. He moved toward the door to the basement, his hand hovering near the knob. I was about to stop him when I saw it. The shadows in the corners of the room behind the furniture, they were moving. Not the usual stretch of light, not a trick of the mind. No, these were real. The shadows were alive. "Ryan, don't," I shouted, but it was too late. He grabbed the knob and twisted. The door creaked open, and for the briefest second I thought I saw it. Something tall, something thin and hunched, moving just behind the dark threshold of the basement stairs. Ryan didn't see it. He couldn't. But I felt it. I felt it behind me, the air thick with static pressing against my skin like an invisible hand. I stumbled back, slamming into the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. "Ryan, get away from there," Mia screamed. Ryan turned, his face pale. He froze. His hand was still on the door, but he wasn't moving. "I can't," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't feel my hand." It was like he was frozen in place, the door still ajar, the air colder than it had ever been. The scratching in the walls escalated, becoming louder, faster, more frantic. It was coming from inside the basement now, too. We couldn't run. The house wouldn't let us. "Mia, we have to leave. Now." I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the front door, but it was like trying to move through molasses. Every step was slow, painful. The shadows weren't just in the corners of the room anymore. They were stretching, crawling, reaching toward us. The walls, once solid and comforting, felt like they were bending, shifting, warping around us. We reached the front door, but when I pulled the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was locked. The scratching sound came from right above us now, something dragging itself across the ceiling, scraping down the walls, pulling its body along like it had no bones. A low, guttural growl echoed through the house, a growl that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever heard. Mia screamed. She was holding on to me so tightly, her nails digging into my skin, but I couldn't help her. I couldn't even help myself. I looked over at Ryan, who was standing there, his eyes wide in terror. But he wasn't looking at me. He wasn't even looking at the door. He was staring at something behind me. And I knew that whatever it was already inside. Before I could even react, the sound of scraping claws, wet and horrible, drowned everything out. The ceiling above us buckled, and with it something came crashing down onto the floor, landing with a sickening thud. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see it. But I could hear it, feel it. The house, the thing inside the house, was coming for us. And the last thing I remember before I ran, tearing through the front door, was Ryan's voice. Hollow, faint. It wasn't even his voice anymore. It was the house speaking through him. Don't leave. You belong here. The moment I walked into the Holloway apartments, I knew something was off. But at the time, I couldn't quite place it. The dim hallway, the creaky floorboards, the stale smell of old plaster. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but it had a strange kind of character that I couldn't resist. I had been looking for a new place to live for weeks, but the rents in Black Hollow were high, and the options weren't exactly what I had in mind. So, when Ms. Driscoll told me about the loft on the 4th floor, I figured it was worth a shot. You're the first tenant in Unit 4B in, well, a long time, Ms. Driscoll had said when she handed me the keys, her smile a little too wide, a little too practiced. Hope you don't mind a little history. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. History? The apartment was beautiful. Exposed brick, original hardwood floors, huge windows that looked out onto the decaying industrial district of Black Hollow. It felt like a photographer's dream. A place with character, perfect for the lifestyle I had in mind. The rent was cheap for such a space, but I was used to that. Freelance work doesn't exactly bring in a steady paycheck, so finding a place like this seemed like a gift from the universe. Ms. Driscoll had led me through the unit, pointing out the high ceilings, the open layout. Everything about it screamed artistic space. When she left, I had moved in the next day. The area wasn't great, Black Hollow had seen better days, but it was close enough to the city to be convenient. I didn't care much about the neighborhood. I had a camera, a few basic furnishings, and the loft was everything I could have asked for. For the first few days, I was happy. I could feel the creative energy buzzing in the air, especially in the evenings when the golden light filtered through the grime-coated windows. It was a place where I could focus, where I could finally make progress on my photography. It felt like my own space, isolated, private, just me and the city outside. But it didn't take long for the oddities to start. At first, it was subtle, little things that could be explained away. I would set my coffee mug down on the kitchen counter, only to find it shifted an inch to the left when I came back. It was so small that I dismissed it as a trick of the light, or maybe me being forgetful. The bathroom light flickered sometimes, but I figured it was the old wiring in the building. The air around the closet in the bedroom would get cold, but I chalked that up to the poor insulation. One night I woke up feeling uneasy. I wasn't sure why, but I had the distinct feeling that someone was in the room with me. The bed felt colder than usual, and when I pulled the covers tighter around me, I swore I heard a soft sound from the wall beside the bed. At first I thought it was just the building settling. Old wood, old pipes creaking under the weight of time. But then, I heard it again. 3 soft taps on the wall. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just a rat or the building's pipes. The place was old, after all. But then it happened again. The tapping, 3 soft knocks on the wall, every night, at exactly 3:17 a.m. At first, I tried to ignore it. It could have been anything. A burst pipe, something in the walls, a neighbor's plumbing. I wasn't going to jump to conclusions, but the timing was too perfect. Every night without fail, those 3 knocks would echo through the dark. One night, after the 3rd round of knocking, I decided to investigate. I had nothing else to do, and my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and walked to the wall where the knocks seemed to come from. I pressed my ear against it, hoping to hear something, anything that would explain the sound. but there was nothing. No pipes, no mice, just silence. That's when I realized the sound wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from inside it. My heart sank as I stood there, pressing my ear against the cold plaster, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. That wasn't the sound of a building settling or water moving through old pipes. It was the sound of something intentional, something alive. I stood there for what felt like hours, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The knocking stopped, and for the first time since moving in, the apartment felt too quiet, unnaturally so. I pulled away from the wall and backed up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't until later that night when I tried to sleep that I realized I couldn't ignore it any longer. The feeling of being watched, that creeping unease, had settled over me. And it was growing. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves, that I was overthinking things, but deep down I knew something was wrong. Something was in that apartment with me, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could ignore it. The next day I went to the landlord, Ms. Driscoll, to ask about the history of the building. She smiled that same unnerving smile and told me there was nothing to worry about. She had been there for years after all, and never heard anything unusual. She even mentioned that I was the first tenant to sign a lease for Unit 4B in a long time. But when I asked her about the factory fire, about the workers who had died, she changed the subject quickly. At the time, I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. But as I turned the key in the lock to my apartment later that night, I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. Something wasn't right. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, I knew that it was only the beginning. The first few days after the knocking incident, I convinced myself that I had just imagined it. Maybe it was the isolation, the late nights, or the fact that I'd been working long hours editing photos and poring over old film negatives. You know how it is when your mind starts playing tricks on you. Still, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The apartment, with its towering ceilings and exposed brick, felt colder somehow, even when the heater was running full blast. I'd wake up every morning to find my breath visible in the air, a fog of condensation that would disappear as soon as I started moving around. It didn't make sense. The heat worked fine, but the temperature still felt wrong, like something was pulling it away from me. It was as if the space itself had an eerie, otherworldly chill that never quite left. It was around this time that I started noticing more strange things. Little, inconsequential things that would have been easy to ignore if they didn't all seem to happen at the same time every day. The coffee mug. At first, it was just an odd occurrence. I'd set it down on the counter, go into the other room, and when I returned, it was always an inch or two to the left. The first time it happened, I chalked it up to being in a hurry, maybe knocking it slightly when I walked past. But the second time, I paid more attention. No, it wasn't a bump or a nudge. It was as if the mug had deliberately moved by itself. And that feeling, like something was watching me, that sense of not being alone, came back with it. I tried not to dwell on it. I was living alone in an old building. Of course, things were going to be a little wonky. I was still adjusting to the space, to the quirks of the apartment. But when I went to the bathroom and saw the light flickering, blink, 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 it wasn't like any flicker I'd ever seen before. The light didn't flicker at random. It blinked in a perfect pattern, almost rhythmic, like someone was consciously doing it. I could feel my nerves starting to fray. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I was starting to wonder if the place was haunted. I hated that word, haunted, but I couldn't think of a better way to explain it. These things weren't just coincidences. They were happening too, often, too predictably. But it wasn't just the little things that had me on edge. One afternoon, after an unusually long stretch of editing photos for an upcoming exhibit, I decided to take a break and stretch my legs. The sun was starting to set, casting that warm golden glow through the windows. It was the kind of light that made everything look beautiful, peaceful. But the moment I stepped out of the living room and into the bedroom, I stopped dead in my tracks. The closet door was open. Not wide open, but enough that I could see a sliver of the dark interior. I knew I had closed it before. I always closed it. There was no reason for it to be ajar. I couldn't remember leaving it open, but I could also see how I might have done it absent-mindedly. So I shrugged it off, closed it, and went back to my photos. But the next day, it happened again. And then the day after that. The closet door would be open just a crack every time I came into the room. I figured I was just being paranoid, that I was imagining things. The place was old. Maybe the door was just out of alignment. It didn't help that the draft from the hallway often made the apartment creak and groan. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more the unsettling feeling grew. It was as if something was deliberately opening that door, as if something was waiting inside. I decided I'd check the hinges, make sure everything was in place. But when I did, I realized something that made my stomach drop. The hinges were perfectly fine. Nothing was out of place. The door was as solid as it had ever been, and yet it kept opening. At this point, I couldn't just laugh it off anymore. I had to admit it. Something was wrong here. Then came the knocking. It started the same way every night. Soft, rhythmic, unmistakable. 3 knocks on the bedroom wall. Every night, without fail. And it always happened at the same time. 3:17 a.m. I had been lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to relax, when I heard it. Soft taps, barely audible at first, but still unmistakable. 3 taps. Knock, knock, knock. My heart skipped a beat. I lay there for a long time, not moving, not breathing, my mind racing. It couldn't be the pipes again. It couldn't be the wind or a rat or anything normal. This wasn't the kind of noise that had a simple explanation. It was the sound of something that wanted to be heard, something that was deliberately making its presence known. I reached for my phone, hoping the light would steady my nerves, but when I checked the time, it read exactly 3:17 a.m. I swallowed, hard, my throat dry. This was ridiculous. But the truth was, I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to believe it, but I also couldn't ignore it anymore. There was something in this apartment, something in the walls, something waiting for me. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, I knew deep down that I was not alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The knocks at 3:17 a.m. weren't just coincidental. I'd tried to reason with myself, tried to tell myself that it was just old pipes or the building settling like any other old place. But after days of feeling like I was being watched, after hearing that sound, those 3 distinct knocks, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I spent most of the next morning pacing around the apartment, waiting for any sign of the noise, trying to pinpoint the source. I wanted to be wrong. I needed to be wrong. But as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the apartment, I found myself feeling even more trapped inside. The dark corners of the room seemed to press in on me, and the silence felt like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. That's when I noticed it. The loose panel in the ceiling had been there since I moved in, but I hadn't thought much of it. It was just a small, inconspicuous part of the wall above the kitchen area, tucked next to the large industrial-style windows. There had been something about it, something off. The edges looked weathered, worn in a way that made the rest of the room seem pristine. I knew I hadn't noticed it when I first toured the apartment, but maybe I had missed it, too distracted by the gorgeous exposed brick and the high ceilings, the kind of thing you find only in these kinds of lofts. But now, with the apartment growing colder by the hour, I couldn't ignore the sensation that something was just out of reach, hiding behind the walls of this place. I grabbed a small stepladder from the closet, my heartbeat thumping louder with each second. I wasn't sure why I was doing it. I hadn't even decided what I thought I might find, but something told me that this panel, this small, seemingly insignificant part of the apartment, was a key to something I wasn't ready to face. I stood on the ladder, my breath shallow as I worked at prying the loose panel from the wall. It came away easier than I expected, as if it had been waiting for me to open it. The hidden space beyond it was small, just enough to crawl into. The smell that greeted me was thick and stale, like dust and years of neglect, mixed with a metallic tang that made my skin crawl. I hesitated before I climbed inside, feeling foolish. Why was I doing this? The air felt heavier here. There was an oppressive weight in this little crawl space that pressed against my chest. But I had to know. I couldn't stop myself now. The space wasn't wide enough for me to stand, so I had to crawl on my hands and knees. The floor was damp, the concrete rough against my palms. I shivered despite the heat from the apartment's radiators, the chill of the crawl space far worse than the apartment itself. It felt wrong in here, like I was trespassing in a place I shouldn't be. I moved deeper into the small space, the walls so close I could barely breathe. As I crawled forward, something caught my eye in the dim light. Newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, half covered by dust and cobwebs. I reached for them hesitantly, my fingers brushing against something small and hard. At first I thought it was a rock or debris, but when I pulled it into the light, I saw it clearly. A doll. Its face was smudged with soot, the eyes faded and chipped, the mouth twisted into an unsettling smile. It was just a child's toy, but there was something about it that unsettled me more than anything else. It looked like it had been placed here deliberately, almost like it had been waiting for someone to find it. I dropped it. The noise it made, hitting the floor, was louder than I expected, echoing through the crawl space. But it wasn't the doll that scared me most. It was the note, the crumpled piece of paper that had been tucked behind it, barely visible but unmistakable. I unfolded the note with trembling fingers, the handwriting jagged and frantic, as though the person had written it in a hurry. I couldn't read it all at once, but the words burned into my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the message was meant specifically for me. The words were, "It doesn't belong to you. It never did." A chill ran down my spine. Who had written this, and why? I stared at the paper, my hands shaking. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. This place, this apartment, wasn't just a building. It wasn't just an old factory converted into luxury lofts. It was something else, something darker, and it was reaching out to me. Suddenly, the floor beneath me creaked. My breath caught in my throat as I froze. It was subtle at first, just a faint groan of the wood, but it was enough to make my heart race. I turned quickly, trying to make my way back toward the exit. But before I could get far, a sound came from behind me. Soft, almost imperceptible, like something scraping against the concrete floor. I spun around, panic gripping me. My eyes darted around the crawl space, but there was nothing. Nothing but shadows and dust. The noise stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow moving across the floor. Not from the walls, but from beneath the floorboards, as if something was dragging itself through the space below me. I didn't wait to see what it was. I scrambled backward, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I crawled back toward the opening. The air seemed to press in on me as I moved, suffocating, heavy. When I reached the opening, I didn't hesitate. I shoved the panel back into place, my heart thudding in my chest. I stood there in the dimly lit apartment, my breath, ragged sweat beading on my forehead. I didn't know what was down there in the crawl space. I didn't know what it wanted. But I knew one thing for sure. I had just uncovered something that should have stayed buried. And now, whatever it was, it knew I had found it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The chill in the apartment had grown more persistent in the last few days. I tried to ignore it, tried to dismiss it as just an old building being an old building. After all, it was only an apartment. No, different from any other. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't just the usual quirks of a place built nearly 100 years ago. There was something else here, something in the air, something that followed me from room to room, unseen but never unfelt. That night, it was worse. I had just finished editing a batch of photos for a freelance gig and was about to crawl into bed when the silence grew thick, almost suffocating. The usual background hum of the city, traffic, distant voices, the occasional honk of a car horn had faded. It was as if the whole city outside had disappeared, leaving only the oppressive stillness of the loft behind. The clock read 3:12 a.m. I told myself to relax, but the tension in my shoulders was almost unbearable. The apartment was colder than usual, despite the heat running. I stood and walked into the bathroom, hoping the brief distraction would help. The fluorescent light buzzed when I flicked the switch, throwing the room into stark white illumination. I stared at myself in the mirror, watching as my reflection stared back with hollow eyes, and for the briefest moment, I felt the urge to bolt. Just run. But where would I go? The knock came. Soft, deliberate. 3 distinct taps on the bedroom wall, just like clockwork. It was as if the sound had timed itself to perfection, the kind of knock that was both familiar and horrifying. I felt my blood run cold, and for a long moment, I didn't move. I stood frozen in the bathroom, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to go into the bedroom, but I couldn't ignore it. Something was calling me, pulling me toward it. Against every rational instinct, I found myself walking back into the bedroom, the air feeling heavier with each step. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, the silence pressing in like a vice. I stepped cautiously into the room, my eyes scanning the dim corners for any sign of movement. The space felt wrong, more so than ever before. The walls, the shadows, they all seemed to close in around me. The knocking had stopped, but the oppressive silence lingered, thick like a storm waiting to break. And then, I saw it. In the dim light at the foot of my bed, something shifted, a silhouette, tall, unnaturally thin, its outline wavering like a mirage. I froze, my heart slamming in my chest as the figure seemed to grow in the darkness. I thought for a moment that it might be a trick of the light, an illusion, but then it moved. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and they jerked and twitched with each movement. The joints cracked, popping like dry branches breaking in the wind. My stomach twisted in disgust, and I stepped back, my feet stumbling over the rug. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, too terrified to scream, too paralyzed to run. The figure didn't speak at first. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough to send waves of terror through my body, and then, just as my breathing began to quicken, I heard it. A low, ragged breath, coming from somewhere deep within its chest. Wet, uneven, like something that had been buried too long and was finally emerging to breathe again. It moved toward me with a slow, deliberate pace, its limbs scraping against the floor as it crawled toward me. The air grew thick, heavy with a suffocating, rancid smell that made my stomach lurch. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move, my legs locked in place as if the very floor was holding me still. And then just inches away, it whispered, "You're in my room." The voice was low, guttural, a sound that rattled my bones. It wasn't a human voice, but something far older, something that had never been meant to speak to a living soul. I could feel the breath against my ear, hot and foul, as the creature's face, if you could call it a face, shifted into view. It was a grotesque, half-formed thing, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that split its face wide open. The skin was pale, almost translucent, with veins visible just beneath the surface, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. In that moment, every ounce of fear I had ever felt in my life erupted into panic. I wanted to scream, to run, to get away. But my body refused to obey. The only thing I could do was stand there shaking, paralyzed by terror as it moved even closer. I could hear its breath, feel its cold presence creeping up behind me like something that was never meant to be there. The room seemed to darken further, the walls closing in as I felt the temperature drop another few degrees. I could hear the sound of the building groaning under the strain, as though the very foundation was being ripped apart from below. The thing moved even closer, its breath hot and foul against my neck. I felt its fingers graze my skin, cold and clammy, sending a wave of nausea through me, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. It didn't retreat, didn't leave. It just paused. I stood there, too terrified to move, too terrified to even breathe. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to tear my eyes away from the creature, forcing my legs to move. I ran. No, I bolted. Out of the bedroom, through the loft, down the stairs and out the door into the freezing cold of the night. My bare feet hit the pavement, and I didn't stop running until my lungs burned and the sound of my footsteps in the night was the only thing left. I don't know how I made it out of the loft that night. My body was moving on pure instinct, my mind frozen in shock, my legs pumping in a blur. I remember the door slamming behind me, the echo of it ringing in my ears, the freezing air biting into my skin as I bolted down the stairs and out into the street. The world outside was quiet, unnervingly so, even the usual hum of traffic. The distant sounds of life on the other side of the city seemed to have vanished. I stood there, gasping for air, heart pounding like a jackhammer in my chest. My breath came in shallow, desperate gasps, and the cold that crept in under my skin felt like a sharp, stinging reminder that I wasn't safe. Not really. I had no idea where to go. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The thing at the foot of my bed, it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But it was real, wasn't it? I could still feel the heat of its breath on my neck, the way it had whispered those words in my ear, its fingers brushing against my skin. I was certain it was real, and the certainty of that truth was enough to paralyze me all over again. I walked, numb and disoriented, not sure of where I was going, but unable to stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the thing again, its face, twisted in that grotesque grin, its hollow eyes staring right through me. I couldn't get its voice out of my head, the rasping, low whisper telling me that I was in its room, that I didn't belong. I eventually found myself standing outside a motel, the neon sign flickering weakly in the distance. I had no memory of getting there, but I didn't care. I didn't have the mental capacity to care. I pushed through the glass doors, barely registering the bell above the counter as I approached the clerk. I had no luggage, no plans. All I wanted was a place to not think, a place to just exist without the weight of the loft hanging over me. The clerk gave me a strange look, but I didn't care. I paid in cash, took the key, and stumbled toward the room. My body was running on fumes now, my mind overwhelmed by exhaustion, but every step I took felt like wading through molasses. I barely registered the dingy wallpaper, the faint musty smell, or the low hum of the refrigerator in the corner. I just wanted to collapse. But as I stood there, the door to the room half closed behind me, I heard it again. 3 soft taps. The sound came from the closet. I froze, my body stiffening, my chest tight with fear. The last place I wanted to be was near another closet, near another room that I didn't belong in. But this time it was different. I wasn't in the loft anymore. I wasn't in 4B. I was in a motel room on the other side of town, hundreds of miles away from Holloway Apartments. But it didn't matter. I couldn't escape it. The sound wasn't real, I told myself. It couldn't be. I was safe now, wasn't I? I closed my eyes and counted to 5, trying to force my heart to slow down, to calm my nerves. When I opened my eyes again, I was still, standing in the same room. The knocking had stopped. But then I heard it, whispered, faint but unmistakable. "You're in my room." The voice was low, almost mocking, and my body went cold with fear. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. But the room was empty. No shadowy figures standing at the foot of the bed, no twisted thing lurking in the corner. Nothing. It was just me. But I felt it. I felt the presence, just like I had in the loft. The weight of it pressing down on my chest, the air turning thick and heavy as if something was moving just beyond my vision. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. My thoughts were a blur, too fast to catch, but one thing kept repeating in my head. I needed to leave. Now. I grabbed my things, my camera bag, the jacket I had left on the chair, and I rushed out of the motel room, not bothering to lock the door behind me. I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was getting away from that thing, from whatever had followed me here, whatever had claimed the space I had inhabited. I rushed down the hallway, past the motel clerk, who was too busy with something, on his phone to notice me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran outside, into the cold, my bare feet slapping against the concrete as I made my way to the nearest bus stop. I didn't care where the bus went. Anywhere would be better than where I was. As I sat there waiting for the bus, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Ms. Driscoll, the leasing agent. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the screen. I hope you enjoyed your stay in Unit 4B. You won't be the last. I didn't respond. I didn't want to. I just wanted to get out. The bus arrived and I climbed aboard, clutching the strap above me, staring straight ahead. The city passed by in a blur, but the fear didn't leave me. It lingered like a shadow, clinging to my every step. And in the back of my mind, I knew the truth. I would never be free of it. The thing from the loft, the thing that had whispered in my ear and claimed the room, it wasn't tied to the apartment. It wasn't tied to the city or the building. It was tied to me. I could run. But I couldn't escape. Not really. And I knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before it found me again. I'll admit it. I didn't believe in ghosts. After years of working as a burnout journalist stuck in the grind of chasing the next big story, I was craving something different. So when I stumbled across a listing for a cabin tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains, my first instinct was to grab it. A week of peace and solitude, with nothing but the wind and the crackling fire to keep me company. It seemed like the perfect reset. Maybe I could write again, or at the very least, sleep without the weight of deadlines pressing down on me. I packed up my old Subaru and made the long drive from Chicago to Hollow Creek, West Virginia. I was in desperate need of space, both physically and mentally. The cabin was advertised as being completely off the grid. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, no distractions. The listing promised serenity and privacy. And the price? Far too good to be true. When I arrived at the cabin, nestled deep in the woods and surrounded by towering pines, I couldn't help but marvel at the isolation. The building itself looked as though it had been abandoned for decades. The cedar, logs had darkened with age, the roof sagging in places where time had worn away at it. The front porch creaked beneath my feet, and the wind whispered through the trees as if the forest itself was speaking. Mr. Vickery, the landlord, had warned me when I met him in town. He was an odd sort of man, with a raspy voice and weathered, hands that spoke of years spent in the wild. As he handed me the keys, he looked me in the eye, really looked at me like he was searching for something before he said, "Don't go out after dark, and whatever you do, don't answer the whispers." I couldn't tell if he was serious or just a local with too many ghost stories rattling around in his head, but his tone was enough to make me pause. I nodded politely, smiled, and promised I'd be fine. Then I drove the last few miles down the narrow, winding road to the cabin, feeling the excitement of what was supposed to be a peaceful retreat wash over me. That night, I set up the fire in the stone hearth and unpacked my things. I had no real plans, just an empty notebook and an old typewriter I had brought for inspiration. The wood inside the cabin smelled like earth and age, the kind of scent you'd expect from something that had been around for generations. The silence was profound. No cars, no people, just the soft rustling of trees outside the cabin and the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. I was tired, but not exhausted. The cabin felt welcoming in its own way, familiar, even though it was so far removed from anything I knew. I opened a bottle of wine and poured myself a glass, then sank into the armchair by the fire, feeling the weight of the day lift as I watched the flames dance. The night felt perfect. I could hear the wind outside howling through the trees, but inside everything was quiet, at least for a while. It was just past midnight when I heard it. 3 soft knocks on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. My body went rigid. I froze for a moment, staring at the door as though I'd imagined it. Maybe it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon, scratching at the door. But that didn't make sense. There was no one for miles, no houses, no lights. I walked slowly to the door, my feet heavy on the creaky floorboards. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I hesitated. A gut feeling told me I shouldn't open it, but I did anyway. I swung the door open and looked out into the inky darkness. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face. The porch was empty. There were no footprints in the snow, no signs of anything. The trees swayed in the wind, their bare branches scratching against each other like skeleton fingers. I stepped back, locking the door behind me, dismissing the moment as some strange occurrence. Maybe the wind had knocked against the door, or maybe it was just a raccoon pawing at the wood. I laughed at myself, brushing it off. Back in the warmth of the cabin, I sat down in front of the fire again, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. The night stretched on, and I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind, focusing on the crackle of the flames. But sleep wasn't coming easily. My eyes kept darting to the door, and my mind wouldn't stop spinning. The wind outside howled again, louder now. Then came the knocks, 3 sharp taps on the door again. Knock, knock, knock. I couldn't ignore it this time. My heart started to race, and I found myself standing in front of the door again, unsure of what to do. I felt the irrational urge to open it to see what was there, but I couldn't make myself move. Something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was out there watching. I locked the door once more and checked the windows, closed tight, no one in sight. The tapping stopped after a while, but the silence that followed was almost worse. The wind had died down, and the woods outside had gone still. Unnaturally still. I finally made my way to the small bedroom upstairs. The bed was soft, but the blankets felt too warm for the cold mountain air. I pulled them off, but still, I felt a chill creeping in. My mind raced, thoughts tangling together, in a mess of fear and confusion. I tried to sleep, I wanted to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the image of Ezra Holloway, his gaunt face, his wide staring eyes, flashed behind my lids. I couldn't escape it. The air in the room felt heavier, like it was pressing against me. I couldn't breathe, and then the whispers started. Not from outside the cabin, not from the wind, but from inside. They were faint at first, too faint to understand. I strained to hear, listening as the sound grew louder. Low murmurs, raspy voices that seemed to come from nowhere, and everywhere. It was as though they were coming from the very walls themselves. I sat up in bed, my heart thundering in my chest. I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from, but I could feel it all around me. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Then a single word rang out clear as day. Hungry. I bolted upright, eyes wide, and for the first time, I was sure of one thing: I wasn't alone. The whispers continued, but I didn't wait to hear more. I grabbed my phone, praying for a signal, but the screen remained blank. Nothing. The silence outside the cabin seemed suffocating now, the absence of sound more menacing than the whispers themselves. The night had only just begun, and already, I knew, the real nightmare was just starting. The morning after my first unsettling night in the cabin, I awoke to an eerie stillness that felt wrong. At first, the quiet was peaceful, almost comforting, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you've stumbled into a forgotten world, untouched by time. The sun filtered weakly through the trees, casting long shadows on the snow outside. The air felt crisp, sharp even, and I found myself breathing deeply as though trying to purge the weight of the previous night's events. But the quiet, while soft and gentle, held a heaviness that I couldn't shake. I had tossed and turned all night, haunted by the whispers, the knock on the door, and the strange feeling that someone or something was standing just outside the reach of my sight. I thought I had imagined it. I convinced myself that it was nothing but an overactive imagination, maybe even a side effect of too much stress. But when I awoke, the fear still lingered, like the faintest taste of metal on my tongue. The bed, though it was comfortable, felt too warm, stifling almost, and I threw off the covers, desperate for some fresh air. I slipped out of bed and padded softly down the stairs, the old floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The kitchen was as cold as the rest of the cabin, and I made my first cup of coffee in the old pot on the stove, the one that smelled of iron and rust from years of use. As the steam rose, I gazed out the small kitchen window, watching the frost that clung to the trees like remnants of forgotten stories. But there was something unsettling about the stillness. I hadn't seen a single animal yet. No birds, no deer, no signs of life in the snow around the cabin. It was as if the whole world had been muted, like everything was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off. I had come here to write, to reconnect with my work, to get away from the endless grind of deadlines and city life. I grabbed my notebook and decided to go outside, breathe in the fresh mountain air, and try to shake off the dread that had settled so deeply in my bones. The chill bit at my cheeks as I stepped out onto the porch. The snow crunched beneath my boots, and the wind whistled through the trees. It was beautiful in its own way. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that it wasn't just the silence of the forest, it was the feeling of being watched, of being alone but not quite alone. That afternoon I tried to write, but nothing came. The words felt heavy, as though the cabin was pressing them down with the weight of its history. My mind kept drifting back to the events of the previous night. The knocks, the whispers, the presence I couldn't explain. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick with something I couldn't name. And then when I looked at my journal, I saw it. The page I'd written on the day before was filled with scribbled lines and jagged writing, nothing like my usual neat script. I stood over the notebook, my heart beating faster, unsure of how it had gotten that way. Had I written this in my sleep? In some sort of half-dream state? But I hadn't been dreaming. I'd been awake, terrified even. The handwriting was erratic, slanted, and almost not mine. It's hungry. It's waiting. You can't run. It's waiting for you. I froze. My hand shook as I turned the page, expecting to see more, expecting to see something more terrifying. But the next page was empty, just blank, like nothing had been written there at all. I quickly closed the journal and shoved it into the drawer, trying to push the gnawing feeling away. That night I didn't know what to expect. My sleep had been fitful, filled with strange dreams, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. The dreams began almost as soon as I closed my eyes. At first they were blurry, fragmented memories of a man, Ezra Holloway. I saw him in flashes, his face too wide, too stretched. His eyes, they seemed to follow me wherever I went, watching me as I walked through an unfamiliar forest. The trees bent around me, their branches twisting like fingers, reaching out to grab me. The air was thick with something unspoken, and all I could hear was his voice, low and gravelly, whispering, "They're hungry." I tried to wake myself, but every time I thought I had, the dream shifted. The setting changed, and suddenly I was back in the cabin. But it wasn't quite the same. The fireplace was burning, but the flames were blue and cold. The room was dark except for the faint light of the fire, casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the walls like a macabre puppeteer. My breath was visible in the air, though I knew the cabin wasn't that cold. Then I saw it, a face in the mirror, but it wasn't mine. It was gaunt, hollow-eyed, twisted. It stared back at me with an unnatural hunger, its features contorted in a grotesque grin that stretched too wide. I reached out to touch it, and the reflection didn't move. The face didn't blink. It just watched me. And then, just as my fingers brushed the glass, the voice came again, this time not in a whisper but a rasping, guttural growl. "It's hungry. They're hungry. And you're next." I woke with a start, gasping for air. My heart pounded in my chest, my skin cold with sweat. The room was dark, and for a moment I couldn't tell if I was still in the dream or if I had actually woken up. I sat up, my pulse racing, the fear gnawing at my mind. But the cabin was silent. Too silent. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:17. Also in the hour I had been warned about. I could hear the creaking of the floorboards above me, the faint scraping of something that seemed to move across the ceiling. My eyes snapped up to the darkened rafters, and for a moment I thought I saw something move. A shadow. darker than the dark itself. My breath hitched as I forced myself to stay still, to breathe. Then, the whispers came again. Not from outside, not from the trees or the wind. They were coming from the walls, soft, barely audible but unmistakable. "They're hungry." I bolted upright, heart hammering, but the words were gone as quickly as they had come. Silence. Cold, suffocating silence. It was as if the cabin itself was waiting, watching, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay. By the third night, I was no longer just tired. I was unraveling. There was a tightness in my chest that wouldn't go away, a constant creeping dread that settled in my bones. I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, that the fear was all in my head, a product of too much isolation and too much stress. But no amount of reasoning could erase the growing sense that something was wrong with the cabin. The days had passed in a haze, but my sleep was a battleground I couldn't win. I couldn't remember the last time I had slept through the night. Each time I closed my eyes, I was thrust into the same series of horrific dreams. The same visions of Ezra Holloway with his unsettling, too-wide grin and the voice that whispered in the dark. "They're hungry. They're waiting. You can't escape." I tried to keep busy during the day, even ventured out for a hike, but there was nowhere to go that didn't feel off. The woods surrounding the cabin felt alive, but not in a peaceful, natural way. There was something oppressive about the trees, their limbs twisted into unnatural shapes as if they were reaching for me, following my every movement. The wind never seemed to stop howling, even on the clearest days, and at night the stars above felt dim and distant, like they were being smothered by the darkness below. By the time Halloween night arrived, I had stopped trying to ignore the reality of the situation. The whispers had grown louder, more distinct, though still not quite clear. They sounded like they were coming from the walls, the floor, the very foundation of the cabin. I thought about leaving, thought about packing my things and driving back to Chicago, throwing the whole experience away as a bad decision. But something inside me kept pushing me to stay, to figure out what was happening. The worst part was that every time I thought about leaving, a voice in the back of my mind would tell me that it was too late, that leaving would be worse, that I would never escape. That night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. If I was going to be tormented, I might as well get it over with. The night was colder than usual, and the wind howled outside like a living thing. I stayed up late trying to work, but the words wouldn't come. I found myself staring at the dark corners of the room, waiting for something to move, listening for the faintest sound. It came just after midnight, the knocking. 3 sharp, deliberate taps followed by a silence so complete it felt suffocating. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing, my heart hammering in my chest. It had been the same every night since I'd arrived. 3 knocks at exactly 12:03 a.m., always the same, like an old insistent clock ticking down towards something terrible. But tonight was different. I didn't want to get up, I didn't want to open the door, I didn't want to see who or what was out there. But I couldn't stop myself. Something inside me compelled me to go to the door as though I had no choice. I stepped cautiously toward the door, the old wood creaking underfoot. My hand was shaking as I reached for the handle, the cold metal sending a shock through my body. When I touched it, the air around me seemed to freeze, thick with a heaviness that I couldn't explain. I opened the door. Nothing. The porch was empty, the snow untouched, as though no one had been there at all. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring into the darkness. The wind was silent now, and the trees stood still like sentinels in the night. There was nothing. No movement. No sign of life. But then I heard it. A whisper. Soft. Almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. "They're hungry." My breath caught. In my throat, I couldn't move. The voice was coming from behind me now, like a breath on the back of my neck. But when I turned, there was no one there. Just the empty, cold cabin. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding in my chest. The walls seemed to pulse around me, vibrating with something I couldn't understand. The floor beneath my feet felt soft, unstable, as though the entire cabin was about to give way. I rushed to the windows trying to peer out into the darkness, but the storm outside had worsened. The snow was falling so thickly now that it was hard to see anything beyond a few feet in front of me. That's when I heard the tapping again, but this time it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside the walls. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, then silence. I backed away from the wall, my pulse roaring in my ears. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. There was no escaping the feeling that something was watching me, listening. The air felt dense, like it was pushing in from all sides. Then came the scratching. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, like something small was dragging itself across the floorboards above me. But it grew louder, closer, as if it was moving down the hall, dragging its body, scraping its fingers across the wood with agonizing slowness. I couldn't take it anymore. I tried to leave, but every door I opened led to the same thing. The same walls, the same cold air. The whispers had returned, louder now, filling the cabin until the sound was deafening. They weren't just in the walls anymore. They were in my head. In that moment, I realized what I had feared since the moment I stepped inside this cabin. It wasn't just a place. The cabin was alive, and it was hungry. I ran, but it felt like the cabin was shifting, the walls closing in around me. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. I finally made it outside, stumbling into the freezing cold, the snow stinging my face. My breath came in sharp gasps as I ran into the woods, away from the cabin, away from the whispers. But no matter how far I ran, the voices followed me, growing louder with each step. And somewhere in the distance I could hear the echo of Ezra Holloway's voice, repeating the same words over and over again. They're hungry, they're waiting, and I knew deep in my bones that there was no escaping it. Not now, not ever. Halloween night. The storm raged outside, howling through the trees, the wind slamming against the windows as if trying to break through. I sat at the kitchen table, my fingers trembling as I tried to steady the cup of coffee I was holding. The same coldness, the same oppressive silence filled the cabin. I hadn't slept in 2 days, and yet sleep seemed the least of my worries. I hadn't wanted to open the door. I didn't want to see who or what was knocking at my door at 12:03 a.m. But I had, and nothing had been there. Just the cold, the wind, the darkness. Yet the feeling had only intensified. The presence had become undeniable. And when I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. I walked through the cabin, my feet heavy with exhaustion, but my mind more alert than it had ever been. The sounds, the smells, the cold spots, everything had taken on a more sinister edge. The scratching noise, that faint gnawing sound that had been a constant undercurrent in the walls, was now impossible to ignore. It was getting louder, closer. It moved, like something was pacing just above me, behind the walls, scratching, scraping at the plaster as though trying to find a way out. I stopped in the living room facing the fireplace. The ash was undisturbed, but I could feel something shifting in the air. There was something wrong with the room, something oppressive, that made the space feel smaller, as if the walls were inching closer with every passing minute. The sound of the wind outside was muted here, like the cabin had somehow swallowed it whole. That's when I noticed it. In the dim light of the fire, the reflection in the mirror on the far wall seemed off. It was a subtle shift at first. Something I couldn't quite place, but when I looked closer, my stomach dropped. There, in the reflection, I could see a figure, tall, looming. Its face was just beyond the frame, obscured by shadows. But it wasn't me. I knew it wasn't me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move. It just stood there perfectly still, as if waiting for me to look away. I should have screamed, I should have run. But instead I felt rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the reflection. The shadowy figure seemed to lean in, and I could swear I saw its lips part, the faintest outline of a smile, a wide, grotesque grin. "You're in my room," it whispered. The voice wasn't human. It was a low rasp, an animalistic sound, like something alive, but not human. A growl wrapped in words. I couldn't breathe. The words weren't my own thoughts. They were inside my head, like they had been planted there. The reflection seemed to twist, its shape shifting slightly, its movements jerky, unnatural. The figure reached forward, its hand inching closer to the mirror's surface, its fingers stretching out, elongated and grotesque. I couldn't stop it. My legs moved before I even realized what I was doing, stumbling backward toward the kitchen. The mirror was still in front of me, reflecting the darkness of the room. But now I could hear something else scraping at the back of my mind. The whispering. It was growing louder. The figure in the mirror didn't stop. It followed me. I saw it move from the reflection in the glass, reaching behind me like it was there. It was right in front of me. It was touching me. But when I turned around, there was nothing. I ran. I ran through the cabin, desperately slamming doors behind me, locking them with trembling hands. I didn't know where I was going or how I was going to get out. The only thing I knew was that I had to get away from that room, away from the mirror. I ended up in the hallway, pressed against the wall, gasping for air. The cold had seeped into my bones. The whispers didn't stop. They circled around me, slithering into every crack and crevice of my mind. They're hungry. You can't run. It will find you. It always finds you. I clutched my head, trying to block out the sound, trying to keep my mind from shattering. I couldn't think straight. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the cabin was pressing down on me, suffocating me. Every corner of the room felt wrong, as if it was turning in on itself, folding into a space I didn't recognize. And then the knocking began again. 3 slow, deliberate taps at the front door. I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I had to. See? I approached the door, moving like someone who had lost all sense of reason, all sense of self. My hand reached for the knob, my fingers icy cold and numb. I opened the door, but no one was there. Only the wind, and something on the doorstep. It was a doll. A child's doll lying face down in the snow. Its dress was torn, its eyes cracked, its face smudged with soot. The sight of it made my skin crawl, like I had seen it somewhere before, but I couldn't place where. I bent down to pick it up, but as soon as my fingers brushed the doll, a sharp pain shot through my hand. I pulled back. The doll hadn't been cold. It had been alive. It had a pulse. I screamed and dropped it. The doll rolled across the snow like it was alive, its eyes staring up at me with an emptiness I couldn't understand. And then from the woods behind the cabin I heard it. The whispers. Louder now, more insistent, and the sound of boots crunching in the snow. I didn't stay another minute. I didn't think. I just ran, barefoot, with nothing but the night air and my own frantic heartbeat. The whispers had crawled into my mind, so loud and insistent that I could barely hear my own thoughts. They're hungry. It's coming. It's already here. I didn't know if I was running from the cabin or if I was running from myself. The snow crunched under my feet, sharp and biting. I could barely see in the dark, but I didn't care. I didn't need to. All I wanted was to escape. The trees were thick here, towering, skeletal things. They felt like they were closing in on me, casting long shadows that seemed to shift with my every step. I knew somehow that I wasn't alone. I could feel eyes on my back, cold and watching. The wind had died down, and in its place came something worse. Silence. A suffocating quiet that only made the whispers louder in my ears. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the woods, where the faint lights of the road were barely visible. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning my lungs, but I kept moving, desperate to get away from whatever had been stalking me. And then, just as I reached the road, I heard the tapping again. 3 knocks. It wasn't coming from the cabin. It was coming from the woods. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst from my chest. I froze, listening. My eyes darted around, scanning the trees, the darkness pressing in from every side. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I wanted to run, but my body refused to move. It was like something was holding me in place, freezing me to the ground. And then I saw it. A figure. Tall, impossibly tall, emerging from the trees. Like a shadow pulling itself from the depths of some forgotten nightmare. The shape was wrong, too long, too twisted. Its limbs moved at unnatural angles, bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I could barely make out its face, but the mouth, that grin, was unmistakable. It was a sickening, wide stretch of skin, a grotesque mockery of a smile that seemed to open wider with each step it took toward me. I didn't recognize it, but I knew it. I felt it. This thing wasn't part of the world I knew. It wasn't something that belonged here. Not in the woods, not in the cabin. It had been waiting for me. I staggered backward, stumbling into the snow, my feet slick with panic. My heart thudded in my ears and my vision swam. Everything in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs were useless. They wouldn't move. I couldn't escape. That's when I heard the voice. A low, crackling sound that came from the depths of the thing's throat. It wasn't just a voice, it was a feeling, a presence, a compulsion. It's time. The words filled me, pushing against my chest, pressing down on my throat like something cold, like something old. The figure's face was impossibly close now, the stench of rot and decay flooding my senses. I felt my stomach turn, my head spinning as I tried to make sense of what was happening, but I couldn't. It was too much. I couldn't escape. I couldn't fight. The world narrowed to the sound of my heart, the slow, steady thud of it in my chest. The thing reached out with one long, twisted hand, its fingers brushing against my skin. The touch was like ice, like death itself was crawling into my soul. And just before the darkness swallowed me whole, I saw something. A flash. A memory. It was a flash of the mirror, the child's doll, the whispers, the things I had ignored, the signs I had pushed aside in the hope of finding peace. But it wasn't peace I had found. It was something far worse, something older than the mountains themselves. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it stopped. The presence was gone, the tapping, the whispers, the figure, all of it vanished. I don't know how long I sat there in the snow, shivering, my heart still racing. When I finally forced myself to stand, I looked back toward the woods, toward the cabin, but everything was silent again. The tapping was gone. The whispers were quiet. The cabin was still standing in the distance, its dark silhouette cutting against the pale sky. The trees around it looked normal. The moon had broken through the clouds, casting its cold light over the snow-covered ground. But I knew something. The thing I had been running from, it hadn't been real. Not in the way I'd understood. It wasn't a physical creature. It wasn't something you could see or touch or even fight. It was inside the cabin, inside the land, inside the air itself. It had always been there, waiting. I didn't know if I had escaped, or if the thing was still waiting, still watching. But I had. One thought as I turned and ran down the road. I would never go back to that place again. I had never intended to end up here. It wasn't even the kind of place I'd ever imagined myself living. But after the divorce, after everything, the rent on a modest, cheap apartment was all I could afford. No luxuries, no perks. Just a space to call my own for once without the looming pressure of bills and unmet expectations. That's how I found myself standing outside the Blackwood Arms, a decaying, crumbling relic of a time long past. Its once grand Art Deco facade was now tarnished, gray and stained with the marks of decades of rain and neglect. The windows were fogged with years of grime. The overgrown ivy draped across the brickwork like a forgotten memory, and the rusted ironwork on the balcony railings looked like it could collapse with the first gust of wind. I should have known better. Something about the building made me uneasy, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But I couldn't afford to be picky. The rent was cheap, far too cheap for Providence. The landlord, Mr. Doyle, was more than eager. to hand over the keys with a grin that felt too wide. "You're brave," he said, his voice thick with amusement. "Last tenant only lasted 2 weeks." He shrugged it off as if it didn't mean anything, but I could feel the chill that ran through his words. I had no choice but to sign the lease. What else could I do? I was fresh out of a marriage that had lasted far too long, a job that barely paid the bills, and a heart that was still trying to find its footing in a world I didn't recognize anymore. Apartment 3B. It smelled of old carpet, dust, and something else, something faint but there, something that lingered like a ghost in the air. The creaky hardwood floors were stained, the walls cracked and worn down by time, and the windows barely opened. But it was mine. It had to be. And for the first time in a long time, I could breathe. That was until I moved in. The first day was fine. The apartment felt empty, like it hadn't been lived in for years. I unpacked my things slowly, taking my time to make it feel like home. Jinx, my cat, followed me from room to room, curiously sniffing at every corner and inching her way under the couch. She was normally a sweet, easygoing cat, but here she was different. She kept hissing at nothing. I thought nothing of it at first. Old buildings have strange acoustics, and the way the walls creaked when the wind shifted didn't help. But there was something about the way Jinx's fur stood on end when she stared into that dark corner by the bedroom window. The way she crouched low, her tail flicking nervously, eyes wide and alert. But I didn't let it bother me. The second night it started. I woke to the sound of something faint, just barely audible. A whisper. "Maggie." It came from the closet. I sat up in bed, heart thudding in my chest, straining my ears to hear. At first I thought it was just the house settling, but then, again softer this time, "Let me in." I sat frozen in place, too afraid to move, my body paralyzed with a strange mix of dread and disbelief. I thought I'd imagined it. Hadn't I? The apartment was old, after all. Old buildings creaked, groaned, whispered. But the feeling in my gut told me that this wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the wind. The next morning I chalked it up to exhaustion. Maybe I'd been too tired from the move. Maybe the stress had gotten to me. But that afternoon, when I went to the bathroom to shower, I noticed something strange. The mirror was fogged up, and there in the mist were fingerprints, too large to be mine. I rubbed at the glass with a towel, my heart racing again, but the marks wouldn't go away. They stayed, as if someone had pressed their hands against it, leaving an imprint. I wiped the mirror clean, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something else. That night I tried to ignore it. I locked the closet door and left Jinx in the living room with the windows open, hoping the fresh air would help me sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. The house seemed to hum with energy, an almost electric vibration in the air. The old radiator hissed as it kicked on, its clanking filling the silence, but underneath that noise, I could hear the whispers again. "Maggie, let me in." I couldn't tell where it was coming. From the closet, the walls, the floorboards. All I knew was that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was causing it, what was calling my name in the night. But something in me knew. I already knew the answer. This wasn't just a cheap apartment. This wasn't just a bad location. The Blackwood Arms, its history, its stains, its whispered secrets had claimed me, and it wasn't done with me yet. The first few days in the apartment felt like a blur. I kept telling myself that it was just the stress of the move, the divorce, and the change in my life. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe the creaks and groans of the building were nothing, more than what old buildings do: settle, shift, make noises in the night. And I told myself it was just the stress. But when the whispers started again just before 2:34 a.m. on the second night, I knew I couldn't keep making excuses. It was the same thing as before. The cold drafts, the unexplainable sounds, the whispers. "Maggie," it said again. Soft, sweet. A voice that somehow felt familiar and foreign at the same time. My heart pounded as I lay in bed. The sheets twisted around my legs, and I gripped the blankets with my hands, trying to keep my body still. My cat, Jinx, had gone silent, and motionless beside me, her fur bristling. The whisper didn't stop. At first I thought it was coming from the closet. Then I thought it was from beneath the bed, from the walls, from the very air itself. I was losing sleep, barely able to function through the days. The house felt suffocating at night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I went into the hallway, I felt like something was just behind me, watching, waiting. I wanted to leave. I really did. But where would I go? I didn't have the money to just pack up and leave. I had nowhere else to go. It was on the third day that I finally ventured outside the apartment, desperate to get some air and clear my head. As I stepped into the hallway, the heavy scent of dust and mildew mixed with the stale, cold air. The building was dark, with flickering light bulbs casting long shadows along the walls. It looked almost as if time had forgotten it here. The old woman from 3A, Mrs. Pevensey, was sitting on a rickety wooden chair outside her door, knitting something with shaking hands. She looked up at me as I passed, her watery eyes narrowing slightly. Her face was lined with years of worry and neglect. But there was something else in her gaze, something that made my skin crawl. "Hello, dear," she said, her voice rasping, like dried leaves. "Hi," I replied, trying to muster up some politeness. I wasn't in the mood for a chat, but I felt obligated to at least be cordial. Mrs. Pevensey tilted her head slightly as she looked me over. "You hear him, don't you? The whispers?" I froze. My breath caught in my chest. How did she know? I'm not sure what you mean," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice neutral. But she wasn't fooled. "You will. They always do." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The building's got a way of claiming people. You'll hear him soon enough. Silas, he's always watching, you know." I stood there, unsure how to respond. "Silas?" I asked, frowning. She nodded, the tremble in her hands never stopping. "Silas Blackwood, the owner, he died in here, you know. Well, that's what they said anyway." She lowered her voice even further, glancing over her shoulder as if she were afraid someone might hear. "But it's not just him. There's something else, something worse. I wouldn't stay here if I were you, dear." I wasn't sure how to respond to that. The whispers, the strange feeling that had been hanging over me since I moved in. Was it possible this was all connected? But before I could ask anything more, Mrs. Pevensey started rocking back and forth, her eyes turning glassy, focused on something I couldn't see. I backed away slowly and turned down the hallway, my mind racing. Silas Blackwood. The name felt wrong in my mouth. Something told me she wasn't just telling stories. Something about her conviction made me feel like there was truth buried in what she said. I tried to shake the thought from my mind, but it clung to me, following me all the way back into my apartment. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, in bed, the covers tangled around me, Jinx curled up at my feet. I kept hearing it, the whispering, not just from the closet now, but from everywhere. It was like the walls themselves were alive, breathing. The whispering words seemed to come from within my very own mind, curling around my thoughts like an invasive vine. "Let me in, Maggie." The whispers were clearer this time, more demanding. I tried to block them out, pressing my hands against my ears, but it was no use. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. Suddenly, I heard a soft tapping sound. 3 knocks. Couldn't breathe. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt like I was suffocating. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know where it was coming from, but the knocking continued, louder now. 3 taps. Then silence. I sat up, my throat dry, and stared into the dark. I had to know. I had to face whatever was going on here. I stood up, my legs weak beneath me, and walked to the closet, the floor creaking under my weight. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling. The air grew colder as I turned it. But when I opened the door, there was nothing, just empty space. I stood there for a long moment, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, without thinking, I slammed the door shut again. I was starting to understand what Mrs. Pevensey had meant. The Blackwood Arms had a way of claiming people, of drawing them into its dark history, and I had a feeling I wasn't going to get out that easily. I thought I'd hit my breaking point the moment the whispers started. But it wasn't. It wasn't the tapping at my closet door. It wasn't the unease that settled like dust in the corners of the apartment. No, it wasn't until that night, the night the power went out, that I truly understood what I was dealing with at the Blackwood Arms. It was December 23rd, a cold, bitter night that had already settled a thick layer of frost over the windows. The kind of night when you just want to curl up under a blanket and forget the world outside. But of course, that wasn't going to happen in this apartment, in this place. Not anymore. I'd been trying to ignore the whispers all week, trying to focus on the small joys of Christmas, getting my shopping done, wrapping gifts for family. But it was impossible. Every time I sat down to wrap a gift, the whispers would begin. That low, guttural sound that felt like it was coming from the walls, from under the floor. And it wasn't just whispers anymore. It was breathing. Wet, labored, sickeningly slow. As though something, or someone, was waiting just beneath the floorboards, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I tried to block it out, to focus on the task at hand. It was Christmas after all. I couldn't let the weirdness of the building take that from me too. But when the power flickered and then went out entirely, everything shifted. It was like the world around me had gone silent, as though the apartment itself had closed its eyes and exhaled. The sudden darkness in the apartment was suffocating. I grabbed my phone, desperate to use its flashlight. The cold radiated from the walls, the air thick with the absence of light. I could hear Jinx meowing frantically, her paws scraping across the hardwood floors, desperate to find me. I turned on my phone's light, the soft blue glow doing nothing to ease the suffocating feeling in my chest. I got up, stumbling over the furniture in the darkness, trying to find my way to the breaker panel in the hallway. The light from my phone flickered and buzzed, making me feel even more uneasy. The power didn't come back on, and that's when I noticed it. All the knives. They were laid out in a perfect circle on the kitchen floor. All of them. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity. The dull light from my phone cast long shadows, distorting the shapes in the room. The knives, my knives, were placed with an unsettling precision, every blade in a perfect arc, gleaming in the dim light. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight as though something was physically constricting my windpipe. Then I saw it. On the wallpaper, words had been scratched into it, as though someone had clawed them in, desperate, jagged marks that seemed to pulse with something dark. Your turn. My breath caught in my throat. My hands began to shake. There was no way it was just me. No way this was a product of my stress. I couldn't tell myself it was all in my head anymore. It felt too real. I backed away from the knives, my heart hammering in my chest. The apartment, once my safe haven, now felt like a trap. I could feel the oppressive weight of it all pressing in on me, suffocating me. I needed to leave. I needed to get out. But as I took a step back, something moved in the corner of my eye. It wasn't Jinx. I whipped around, the light from my phone catching a shadow by the window. A figure, too tall, its head tilted at an impossible angle as though it didn't quite belong. The figure was so still, so unnatural, and then it took a single step forward. Just one. That was enough to break me. I ran. I didn't even look back. I grabbed Jinx, who was still scurrying around, and bolted for the door. My legs were shaky as I fumbled for my keys. I don't even remember how I got out of the apartment. I just remember the feeling of the cold night air hitting me as I slammed the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was out in the snow, gasping for air, the panic making my vision swim. I couldn't go back inside, not then, not ever. Don't know how long I stood there frozen, my breath coming out in visible clouds. Eventually, I stumbled to the stairwell and down the stairs. I didn't know where I was going. My mind was racing, my body trembling with fear. But I couldn't. Go back there. Not when I had seen it. When I had felt it. I ended up at Mrs. Pevensy's door. She opened it slowly, as though she had been expecting me. The apartment smelled of old incense, and the faint hum of a radio played softly in the background. Her eyes were wide, and for the first time, I saw something other than the usual tremor in her hands. "You saw it," she said, and her voice wasn't a question. I nodded, my throat dry, my chest tight with panic. "What is it? What's happening to me?" Mrs. Pevensey stepped aside and I walked in without asking. I couldn't stand the cold anymore, couldn't stand the open air. I needed answers, needed to understand what was happening. She took a deep breath and closed the door behind me. "You're not the first to see it. Silas Blackwood, the man who built this place. He's still here, but it's not just him. There's something else in the walls, something older. The building, the Blackwood Arms, it traps people. The whispers, the knocking, the things you've seen. It's all part of it." I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew she was right. It wasn't just me. It was the building itself. And I didn't know if I'd be able to escape. "I can't stay there anymore," I said, my voice shaky. Mrs. Pevensey nodded slowly. "No, you can't. And neither can anyone else. You won't be the last. But you're not alone, Maggie. They've always been watching." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. There was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't shake. A presence that lurked just outside my reach. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that tall, twisted figure by the window flashed behind my eyelids, lingering like a shadow that refused to leave. My heart kept pounding in my chest, thudding louder and faster the more I tried to calm down. The chill of the apartment was still in my bones, and the silence that hung around me felt suffocating. Mrs. Pevensey's words echoed in my mind. "It's not just Silas. There's something older. The building traps people." It didn't take long for me to understand what she meant. I had no rational explanation for what had happened. No way to explain the way the knives had been arranged or the scratching on the wallpaper, but I didn't need one. My instincts told me something was wrong with that place, wrong in a way that nothing I'd ever encountered in my life could explain. It was nearly dawn by the time I managed to pull myself together enough to leave Mrs. Pevensey's apartment. Her offer to stay with her was kind, but I wasn't ready to feel trapped again. I needed to get away from that building, from the suffocating air of the Blackwood Arms. I grabbed my things as quickly as I could, barely taking the time to pack. I couldn't look at my apartment, not with that last image of the shadowy figure, still fresh in my mind. I had to leave, had to get out before it came back. I couldn't breathe with the thought of it lurking somewhere behind the walls, its presence seeping out into the air around me. When I stepped outside, the cold air slapped me awake. It felt like a different world, the kind of cold that cut to your bones, but it was a welcome relief. The city felt alive, the streets full of people moving, their voices blending with the steady hum of traffic. It was normal. It was safe. It was everything that the Blackwood Arms wasn't. I walked to my car, my mind spinning with everything that had happened. The strange things, the whispers, the breathing in the walls, everything pointed back to that apartment. There was something in that building, and whatever it wasn't done with me. I knew that now. I drove aimlessly for hours, lost in my thoughts. I tried calling Mr. Doyle again, but my calls went straight to voicemail. Of course, he wouldn't answer. He was just the landlord. He didn't care about what happened to his tenants. He probably didn't even care about the strange rumors that had followed the building for decades. Maybe he didn't know the history of the place, or maybe he just didn't want to acknowledge it. But I knew. I knew I wasn't the first person to feel the strange presence of the Blackwood Arms. I ended up at a diner on the edge of Providence, the neon lights casting a faint glow on the otherwise empty street. I sat by the window, staring out at the night, my mind still racing. The waitress, a woman with dark circles under her eyes, brought me a cup of coffee. Her eyes flickered to the empty booth behind me, her brow furrowing slightly as she handed me the mug. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low, like she was keeping a secret. I didn't know how to answer. No, I wasn't okay. I had just narrowly escaped whatever nightmare was brewing inside that building. But I didn't want to scare her. I didn't want to sound crazy. "I'm just getting away from something," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The waitress nodded, like she understood, and walked off, but I could feel her eyes on me as she disappeared behind the counter. It wasn't until I finished my coffee and stood to leave that I noticed a newspaper clipping pinned to the bulletin board by the door. "Mysterious Deaths at Blackwood Arms." I froze. The headline seemed familiar, but there was something different about it. My hands shook as I reached up to read it. The article was from 1951, the year Silas Blackwood had died, but the details, they were unsettling. Several tenants had gone, missing, their bodies never found. And the ones who had died under strange circumstances? They had all lived in apartment 3B. The room spun around me as I read the words, my mind racing. I had to get back to the apartment. I didn't know why I thought I could escape. Something had already taken hold of me. The whispers, the cold spots, the strange feeling of being watched. It wasn't just in my head. It wasn't paranoia. The building itself was alive with something malevolent. I paid for my coffee, my hands unsteady as I grabbed my jacket and hurried out the door. The moment I stepped outside, I was greeted by the familiar chill of the night air, but it didn't comfort me this time. It felt too much like the air inside that apartment, cold, suffocating, as though something was watching me from the shadows. Drove back to the Blackwood Arms faster than I should have. I had no plan, no idea what I was going to do once I was inside, but I couldn't stay away. I couldn't leave it unfinished. When I reached the apartment, it was dark. The building, looming in front of me like a thing out of a nightmare. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. The front door of the Blackwood Arms was locked, and the buzzer didn't work. But I didn't care. I wasn't going to leave again. I knew what I had to do. Climbed the stairs to apartment 3B, my heart pounding in my chest, every step heavier than the last. As I reached the door, I paused. Something was wrong. The air felt thicker here, colder, and as I reached for the doorknob, I heard it, the sound of something scraping on the other side, something scraping against the walls. The whispers. They had followed me. My hand trembled as I turned the key, the sound of the lock clicking echoing in the dead silence of the hallway. I didn't hesitate this time. I opened the door and stepped inside. The apartment was the same as I remembered it. Empty, quiet, oppressive, but the air was different, heavier. The faint smell of burning flesh still lingered in the walls, and the room was colder than before. It felt wrong. The whispers were louder now, echoing from the corners of the room. And that's when I saw it. The "we" mirrors. The words written in the condensation clearer than they had been before. "Found you," I turned and ran. There was no way I could fight it. No way I could stay. But I knew something now. Something terrifying. The building was alive, and it wouldn't let me go. I had to get out. The words echoed in my head, and I couldn't shake them, no matter how hard I tried. I turned around, the apartment door now wide open behind me, and for a split second I thought I saw something in the corner of my eye. A shadow shifting, but not moving in any way a person should. I couldn't breathe. The cold was suffocating me, thick as fog, filling my lungs with ice as I sprinted back down the hallway. The sound of the whispers followed me, soft at first, like an inaudible hum behind my ears, then louder, so loud it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. Every step I took seemed to echo through the hollow space of the apartment building, stretching the silence thin until it snapped. I was running for the stairs, but I couldn't get there fast enough. It felt like the building was pulling me back, forcing me to stay, to listen. "Let me in, Maggie. You're not done here." I reached the first landing and stopped. The building groaned. The walls sighed. The radiator clicked and clanked behind me, the sound so familiar, so alien all at once. I was standing there on that cold landing, paralyzed by the sheer weight of the air, when the real horror of it sank in. The whispers weren't just noises. They weren't just sounds in the walls or the groans of an old building. They were personal. They knew me. They knew my name. They knew everything. I had walked into this apartment with the naive belief that it was just a place to sleep, that I could put my past behind me, my divorce, my regrets, and live quietly in a cheap, run-down building. But no, this place had an agenda of its own. It wasn't just a building, it was a graveyard, a trap, a prison. And now I was part of it. I couldn't escape. I had thought the power had gone out earlier when everything went dark, but I realized now that it had been the building's influence, the blackness, the cold that had seeped into my bones, the whispering. It was all part of the same thing. It was suffocating me from the inside. I ran toward the stairs again, but this time I could hear something behind me, something heavy, something dragging across the floor. It was close, too close. My breath was coming out in ragged gasps as I turned to face whatever had been stalking me. And there it was, just at the edge of the light, the outline of a figure. A man. A tall man with a face too still, too cold. He was standing in the middle of the hallway, his eyes hollow, empty pits where there should have been light. I could feel the presence of his death, his despair, his rage, pouring out from his body like a cloud of smoke. It's in the walls. The voice came from the man's lips, but it wasn't him speaking. It was the building. It was Silas Blackwood, the man who had died here, who had ended his life in this very building. But he had never left. No one had left, I screamed, turning back to the stairs, my legs carrying me up the steps now, faster than I had ever moved before. But my body felt heavy, like something was pulling me back. I stumbled, slipping on the worn-out steps, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't go back to my apartment. I couldn't go back to 3B. The whispers were coming from every direction now. They were crawling up the walls, snaking through the cracks in the ceiling, rattling the windows until it all blurred into a cacophony of voices that was impossible to ignore. I made it to the 3rd floor and kept running. I had to get out of the building. I had to escape. I finally reached the exit, my hand shaking as I grabbed the door handle, pulling it open. The cool night air hit me like a slap, the outside world feeling so real and solid compared to the nightmare I had just left behind, but the whispers didn't stop. They followed me out into the night. I could hear them clearly now, as if they were right behind me, as if they had followed me from the moment I stepped into that building. The whispers weren't just inside the walls. They were inside my mind. They had marked me. I ran down Elmira Street, away from the Blackwood Arms, away from the horror that had consumed me. I didn't stop until I reached my car, didn't pause until I was sitting in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering, wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. But even then, as I drove through the streets of Providence, the whispers never stopped. They echoed in my ears, in my mind, repeating the same thing. Found you. I couldn't escape. There was no escaping. No place far enough away to outrun it. Because the whispers weren't just in the walls of the Blackwood Arms. They were in me now. I carried them with me. I always would. As I drove through the empty streets, the reality of it all hit me. The building had been designed to trap people, to draw them in, to break them down. And I had fallen right into its hands. I never went back to the Blackwood Arms. I moved, far away, into a new apartment. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. The soft rustle of the radiator clicking. On, the whispering voices that crawl through the air, curling around me, suffocating me with their promises. I know I can't outrun it. I know the whispers will always be there waiting. And every night at exactly 2:34 a.m., I hear the soft scrape of something moving against the walls. And then, the familiar voice comes, faint but unmistakable. Found you. I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. The Blackwood Arms will never let me go, not truly. and I don't think it ever will. It's strange how easily you can fall into the rhythm of a place. The first few days at Lockwood Tower had felt like any other new job. A bit of nervous energy, a lot of paperwork, and the usual office politics to navigate. The building was impressive in that old money kind of way, all marble floors and brass railings, tall windows with that antique look. But the place felt off. Maybe it was the history of the building, the stories I'd overheard during my first few weeks. Lockwood Tower, they said, had a reputation, the whole Lockwood luck thing. The joke was that anyone who worked too late would start hearing things. Footsteps, the whisper of a suit jacket brushing against the wall, sometimes a shadow in the corner of your eye. The company had been around since the 1930s, and with a history that old, you'd expect a few strange occurrences. But I didn't believe in ghost stories. I figured it was just the kind of thing that kept people entertained during long hours. I was a numbers guy, and numbers don't lie. I didn't have time for anything that wasn't directly related to spreadsheets or quarterly reports. Still, something about Lockwood Tower gnawed at me. The first time I stayed late, just a regular night, maybe 8:45 p.m., trying to finish up some last-minute work, the building felt different. Quiet. Not in a peaceful way, but more like the absence of noise. The kind you feel when you're too alone in a big space. You can almost hear the building breathing, settling into the night. The coffee machine on the 17th floor had always been my lifeline during late nights. If you're working through dinner, you need a good cup of coffee to keep your head in the game. But that first night, I noticed something off. I came back from the printer to find it brewing on its own. The coffee machine had been off when I left the kitchen just a minute earlier, but now it was bubbling away, dark and bitter. Smelled like burnt beans, like someone had been brewing for hours. Odd, I muttered to myself. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe it was one of the cleaning staff, though I didn't think any of them came through at night. I shrugged it off and poured myself a cup, but as I took a sip, it was almost unbearably cold. Not just cold, but impossibly cold, as if the machine had been brewing for hours or had been switched off and on repeatedly. I set the mug down and glanced around, but the office was silent again. That deep, unnerving silence. The lights flickered briefly, just once, and I caught a glimpse of the reflection of my own tired face in the glass door of the break room. The first thing I noticed when I returned to my desk was the screen. My computer monitor was flickering, like it was going through one of those electrical glitches that happen when you haven't rebooted in too long. But as I sat down and looked closer, I froze. The screen wasn't just glitching. For exactly 13 seconds, no more, no less, a 1938 stock report flashed up on my screen. It was there for a brief moment before disappearing, like it had been scrubbed away by some invisible hand. The numbers didn't make sense. I didn't recognize them at all, but that wasn't what got to me. It was the date. December 17th, 1938. I didn't know what to think about it. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was some weird bug in the system. But the timing felt too exact. I had been working on some client reports that day, nothing to do with 1938 or any history of the company. Yet there it was, as clear as day, staring back at me. The next few minutes were a blur. My heart was beating a little faster, my palms sweating as I stared at the screen. The printer whirred and beeped. The low hum of the air conditioning was too loud now, and I was starting to feel like I wasn't alone. I glanced up and noticed something that hadn't been there before. A faint dragging sound. It came from somewhere down the hallway, somewhere near the old mailroom, an abandoned space that hadn't been used in years. It was the kind of place you wouldn't even go into unless you had to, and even then you'd keep your head down and get out fast. But this sound, it was unmistakable. Wet. Like something heavy dragging across the floor. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the doorway, the hallway beyond. But everything was still. Silent. The dragging noise stopped as quickly as it started, but the coldness in the air didn't leave. I rubbed my arms, goosebumps rising on my skin, and told myself I was imagining it. The building was just old. It was big. Maybe it was the pipes. But then the knocking started. I didn't hear it at first, but I felt it. It was a subtle, soft thump at first, barely noticeable over the hum of the AC and the whir of the printer. Then it grew louder, sharper, like something, or someone, was tapping against the walls. Not a rhythmic knock, but a single, deliberate tap. Pause, tap, pause, tap. It came from somewhere behind me, from the direction of the old mailroom, and it was so distinct, so intentional, that I couldn't ignore it. My chair creaked as I stood, moving toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached for the handle, my phone buzzed on my desk, just a reminder to file some documents. But the tapping, it didn't stop. Just the wind, I muttered to myself, but even I didn't believe it. The building didn't creak like that, not unless something was causing it. And whatever that something was, I didn't want to find out. Before I could take a step toward the hallway, I heard a voice. "Charlie hates December." I turned to see Frank O'Reilly, the night security guard, standing in the doorway. He was a big guy, solid, but his voice trembled when he spoke. "Who?" I asked, confused. "Charlie Lockwood," he said, his voice a little strained. "He's the one who started all this. You'll hear him. He won't stop." I stared at Frank, unsure of what to say. He chuckled nervously, but the unease in his eyes wasn't lost on me. He wasn't joking. "You'll see," he added, his voice low, almost as if he was afraid to speak louder. "He hates December." That was when I first started to realize that maybe there was something to the stories after all. The next few nights at Lockwood Tower felt like a fog settling over me. I tried to keep my focus on the work, but the unease I'd felt after my first late night lingered like a shadow. The coffee machine, the glitch on my computer, and the tapping noises, they hadn't gone away. They kept happening, each time a little more unsettling, a little more persistent. At first I told myself it was all a coincidence, but after a while I wasn't so sure. I kept my routine the same. I arrived at the office around 8:30 every morning, got my coffee, greeted a few coworkers, and dove straight into my tasks. I told myself to ignore the whispers, the strange occurrences, and focus on the deadlines. But on the nights I stayed, late when the rest of the building had emptied out, I started to notice things I hadn't before. It was a Wednesday, December 21st, when I stayed late again to finish some accounting work. The office was quiet by the time I finished my reports, just me and the hum of the air conditioning. I hadn't heard anything unusual that night. The tapping from the mailroom was gone, and the glitching on my computer hadn't happened again. For a moment I thought maybe I was just imagining things, but then as I was packing up my things and preparing to head home, I noticed something new. The exit signs. At first glance they seemed ordinary, just the usual red lights above the doorways, but when I looked closer I noticed something strange. Every single exit sign on the 17th floor, there were 6 of them, was pointing toward the locked elevator shaft. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silent building, and tried to convince myself that it was just a malfunction. Maybe the wiring was messed up, but no. The signs were deliberate, every one of them. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at them, my heart thudding in my chest. My mind raced to rationalize it. It was probably just a glitch in the system, something to do with the building's age. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I turned and walked back to my desk, trying to focus on the task at hand. But something else caught my attention, a stain on my desk calendar. It was a small mark, but as I leaned in closer, I saw that it wasn't just any stain, it was an ink fingerprint, smudged across December 17th. The date seemed to glow, the ink darker than the rest, as though someone had deliberately marked that day. I wiped my hands on my pants and tried to shake off the sense of dread creeping in. It had to be a coincidence, right? But then I noticed something even stranger. My keyboard. I had left a report open, a list of client transactions, and when I came back to my desk, it was gone. Not deleted, just gone. In its place was a message, typed in a font I didn't recognize. The letters were stark, white against the dark of my screen. Balance the books. I froze, staring at the screen. My heart pounded and my breath caught in my throat. There was no way I had typed that. It wasn't even the same font my computer used, and I hadn't been anywhere near my keyboard when I left. But the message was clear. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stood there staring at the screen. The office felt colder now. The hum of the air conditioning seemed distant, as if it were coming from somewhere far away. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to type anything. I wasn't sure if I wanted to provoke whatever it was that was watching. For the phone rang. It was the building's security line. "Reeves," the voice on the other end said, "I need you to check the emergency exit. The alarms are going off." I hesitated for a moment. The alarms? It was only 11:15. There was no reason for an alarm test at this hour. "Hello?" the voice said again. "Dan, are you there?" I snapped out of my daze and grabbed my coat. "I'll check it now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though my hands were shaking. I grabbed my phone and walked to the emergency exit, feeling the weight of the building pressing in around me. The hallway seemed longer now. My footsteps echoed off the walls as I walked toward the stairwell. When I reached the door, I pulled it open and looked down the dark, narrow staircase. The emergency lights flickered on and off, casting long, uneven shadows along the walls. The door slammed shut behind me, and I heard a voice. "Leave." It wasn't loud, just a whisper, but it sounded like it came from inside the walls. I spun around, my heart racing, but the hallway was empty. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I had to finish this shift. It was probably just stress. The pressure of the holidays, the deadlines, that was all. I walked down the stairs, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle of the exit door, and then I saw it. At the bottom of the stairs, just beyond the doorframe, a shadow moved. It was a tall figure dressed in an old-fashioned suit, the kind from the 1930s. The figure stood still for a moment, then turned and walked into the darkness. I could feel my legs freeze in place. It wasn't just the shock that made me stay put. It was something else. A compulsion. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure turned back toward me, and I saw its face, or at least I thought I did. It was twisted, like the skin had been stretched too tight. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, hollow. It smiled, but it wasn't a smile. It was more like a grimace, an unnatural stretching of its lips. "Leave," it whispered again. But the voice sounded distant, almost like it was coming from a memory. "Or you'll be next." The elevator door to the side creaked open. The metallic clang echoed in the hallway, louder than the whispers. The shadow stepped inside and the door slammed shut. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the spot where the figure had disappeared. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I didn't know what to do. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the emergency exit light flicker again, and for a split second I thought I saw something behind me, a dark shape lurking in the reflection of the glass door. I ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the building and standing in the cold December air. My breath came out in ragged gasps. I felt like I was suffocating. That night I didn't go back inside. I didn't even try to explain it to myself, I just couldn't. Something about Lockwood Tower was changing me, and it was something I couldn't ignore any longer. I made a promise to myself, no more late nights at the office. But as I stepped into my car, my phone buzzed again. It was a text from Frank O'Reilly. "Charlie's still watching. Don't stay. Too late. It's not worth it." The next evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air inside Lockwood Tower felt heavier, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to what I had seen the night before. That shadow, who was it? What did it want? I couldn't get the image of that distorted face out of my head. The hollow, wide eyes, the jagged smile. It haunted me. I had tried to push it aside the moment I stepped out of the building, promising myself that I'd never stay late again, that I'd never work after hours in that place. But here I was again, sitting at my desk, the office empty except for me. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each second echoing in my head. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I couldn't seem to focus. I kept looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to move, for the air to shift. But nothing happened. Not yet. I should have left. I should have packed up, walked out the door, and never come back. But for some reason, I didn't. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was just the crushing weight of my mounting work. Whatever it was, I ignored the instinct telling me to run. By 11:30, I was the only person left on the 17th floor. The lights in the hallways flickered intermittently, and the hum of the air conditioning had stopped altogether. The silence felt suffocating. That's when I heard it, the dragging sound. It started faintly at first, like the scrape of something heavy being pulled across the floor. I glanced at the empty hallway, trying to tell myself it was just the building settling. But then the sound grew louder. It was coming from the mailroom at the far end of the hallway. The same mailroom where I had heard the strange noise the other night. The same place where I'd seen the strange ink-stained fingerprints on the walls. I stood up from my desk, my legs stiff and unsteady, and walked toward the sound. Every step I took felt like it echoed in the emptiness. I knew I should turn back. I knew I should leave. But something compelled me to keep going. The closer I got to the mailroom, the worse the feeling became. It was as if the air was growing colder, thicker. The scraping noise was now accompanied by soft thumps, as though something was stumbling along the floor, dragging itself behind it. I reached the door to the mailroom, and for a moment I stood there, my hand on the knob, frozen. My breath felt shallow. I could feel my heart racing in my chest. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to see what was on the other side, but I did. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the moment it did, I felt a chill so intense it almost took my breath away. The mailroom was pitch black. The only light came from the emergency exit sign above the far door, casting a dull red glow that barely reached the corners. I stepped inside, trying to steady my shaking hands, and called out into the darkness. "Hello? Is anyone there?" No answer. But then, from the darkness, I saw something. A shape, hunched low against the far wall, moving slowly and deliberately. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even human. I could hear the scraping again, but now it was louder, sharper. It sounded like fingers dragging across the floor. I took a step forward. "Hello?" I said again, my voice cracking. My throat felt dry, my pulse hammering in my ears. The shape turned toward me and I froze. It was Charles Lockwood. Or at least it looked like him. But this wasn't the man I had seen in the reflection, not the figure from the hallway. This was something else. Something wrong. His skin was pallid and stretched tight over his bones, his neck at an unnatural angle, his face contorted in a silent scream. He dragged himself toward me, his arms and legs twisted, his fingers bent at odd angles. His eyes locked onto mine, wide and unblinking, filled with an eerie emptiness. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, only a low, rattling breath that sent a cold shiver down my spine. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen in place, my muscles locked with fear. The room seemed to close in around me as Charles slowly dragged himself closer, his eyes never leaving mine. His mouth opened wider, too wide, and I could see the dark, gaping hole in his throat. His body spasmed as he crawled, the floorboards creaking under his weight. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, he spoke. "You can't leave." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. Charles reached out a hand, no, not a hand, just gnarled, twisted fingers, and I felt a pressure on my chest like a weight pinning me down. My heart raced faster, and my vision started to blur. I could hear the sound of my breathing, harsh and shallow, as the cold seeping from the shadows wrapped around me, suffocating me. His fingers brushed my shirt, and I felt the cold seep into my skin, deep into my bones. And then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The dragging sound ceased. The weight on my chest lifted. I gasped, stumbling backward as the mailroom door slammed shut behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I ran down the hallway, past the elevators, past my desk, past everything, until I reached the stairwell. I didn't stop. I didn't even think about the elevator, I just kept running, down 17 flights of stairs through the lobby and out the door into the frigid night. It wasn't until I was outside, standing in the snow, that I allowed myself to breathe again. My hands were shaking, my legs weak beneath me, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't go back, and I didn't. I didn't step foot inside Lockwood Tower again. It's strange, really, how fear doesn't fade. It lingers, even when you think you've escaped it. You convince yourself that the nightmare is over, that you've left it all behind, but it follows you. It haunts the corners of your mind like a shadow that never quite disappears. I remember that night in vivid detail, every second of my escape from Lockwood Tower. But once I was out in the cold Philadelphia air, the frantic pounding of my heart gradually slowed. The tension in my body loosened. I thought that would be it. I thought I'd never have to deal with it again. I was wrong. The next morning, I called in sick. I told my boss I wasn't feeling well, that I'd be taking the day off to recover. I was shaking so hard it wasn't even worth trying to hide it. My fingers were still numb, and the panic attacks started, up again, sporadically throughout the day. I couldn't focus on anything for longer than a few seconds before my mind wandered back to the image of Charles Lockwood's twisted form crawling out of the darkness. When I finally allowed myself to get a full night's rest, I hoped it would be enough to reset, to give me a sense of normalcy. But the next day, December 24th, my phone buzzed with an email from work. It was from my manager, Steve, and the subject line read, "Urgent, please come in." I hesitated for a moment. The thought of returning to the office made my stomach churn. But I had no choice. I hadn't been able to clear things up with anyone. The reality of being in the office, walking through those halls again, felt impossible. But I had to face it. It was a difficult drive back to the tower, even though it was only a 15-minute trip. I kept telling myself that it was all in my head, that I had nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I had felt something in that building, something that wasn't human, and now it was impossible to deny. No matter how hard I tried to explain it away, the fear would always find its way back. When I arrived at Lockwood Tower, everything looked as it always did. The towering structure cast its long shadow over the street, the streetlights flickering as the wind whipped through the trees. Everything seemed cold and still. I hesitated at the door before pushing it open, my hands sweating around the handle. My heart raced and my breath came out in shallow bursts. Inside, the building was eerily quiet. The elevator doors closed with a dull thud as I stepped into the lobby. The receptionist's desk was unmanned, as it usually was on weekends. The entire lobby had a hollow, abandoned feeling. I was alone. The silence pressed in on me from all sides, making it impossible to breathe properly. I took the elevator to the 17th floor, each floor passing in a blur. When the elevator stopped with a soft ding, I stood frozen in place for a second before the doors slid open. The hallway stretched before me, empty and dark. There was no sign of anyone in the hall, no lights on except for the emergency bulbs that cast weak yellow light along the floor. I took a deep breath, the cool air tasting stale in my lungs. Then I stepped off the elevator. It felt like a mistake the moment I did it. I walked toward my office, trying to steady my breathing. I had to go in. I had to see Steve, and I needed to get this over with. But every step I took toward my office felt heavier. The weight of the air seemed to press harder on my chest with each movement. By the time I reached the door, I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, half expecting to see my manager sitting at his desk, but instead the room was dark. The desk was empty except for a single piece of paper resting on top. I stepped closer to it, my feet dragging as though they were weighed down by something. The paper was covered with numbers, some familiar, some I didn't recognize. And it was as if my eyes couldn't focus correctly. But it wasn't just numbers. I could see faintly the scrawling of letters beneath the numbers. The ink was smudged as though it had been hastily written. I reached for it, and that's when I heard it. A sound. Soft at first, then louder. Footsteps. The sound of dress shoes clicking on the polished floors of the hallway. I froze. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone was taking their time walking toward me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up and every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The air seemed to shift. The temperature in the room dropped and I could feel a presence moving toward me, and then the door behind me slammed shut. I jumped, spinning around, my heart leaping into my throat. My eyes flicked toward the window, but there was no one there. No shadow, no figure, nothing except for one thing. On the edge of my desk, in freshly smudged ink, the words were written again. "You can't leave." The sound of dress shoes continued, down the hallway, and I could feel them closing in. My legs finally moved, carrying me back toward the elevator. I didn't even look behind me as I rushed toward the doors, and when I reached them, I slammed the button to call the elevator. It felt like an eternity before the doors finally opened. When they did, I was almost too afraid to step inside. I pressed the button for the ground floor and barely made it out of the building before I collapsed on the sidewalk. I didn't go back. I couldn't. But it wasn't over. The presence followed me even in my apartment. It was just a matter of time before it found me again. I tried everything. The therapy sessions, the medication, the advice from well-meaning friends. I'd even called my old college roommate Rachel in a moment of desperate vulnerability. She told me to take it easy, that it was just stress, the kind that hits when you're dealing with everything I had been. New job, a divorce, the city life pushing me to my limits. And for a while I tried to convince myself that maybe she was right, but I knew better. The events at Lockwood Tower weren't just some product of an overactive mind or too much caffeine. The truth, as much as I hated it, was undeniable. Something from that building had followed me. It hadn't stayed locked behind the thick walls of the tower. It had attached itself to me and it wasn't letting go. I thought I could outrun it by moving to a new apartment, changing my routine. I took the train to work every day, and for a while, I felt safer. I'd even gone back to my childhood home for a weekend to get away from the city. But the feeling never left me. It stayed with me like a heavy cloak that I couldn't shake off. It was in the sounds I couldn't explain. Faint scratching noises that came from the walls late at night, the creaking of floorboards when I was alone. It was in the shadows that seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally when I'd glance away for just a moment. It was the way the temperature would drop suddenly, as if I'd walked into an old cellar, no matter what room I was in. And then, it got worse. It wasn't the noises anymore, it wasn't just the temperature shifts or the lights flickering. No, it was the messages. The first time I noticed it, I was half asleep, my eyes bleary from too little rest. I glanced over at my desk where my computer sat, its screen off, but still casting a dim reflection in the dark room. And there it was, clear as day, written in the corner of my monitor. "I'm watching." I sat up immediately, my heart racing. I was alone in the apartment. I hadn't typed anything. Hell, I hadn't even touched the keyboard. I stared at the message until my eyes blurred, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. Maybe it was just a glitch in the system, a result of the software I had running. But deep down, I knew. I knew what it meant. The next time it happened was a few days later, when I opened a file on my laptop. The text document inside was blank, just the usual template, but when I tried to type, I saw that it was already filled with one word, typed repeatedly over and over: run. My hands trembled as I backed away from the screen. I was a mess, tired, paranoid, and haunted. This wasn't stress. This wasn't just my imagination. I had lived through the nightmare at Lockwood Tower, and now it had come with me. I couldn't escape it. I tried to keep myself calm, to rationalize everything, but the more I tried, the worse it got. The whispers began to return, faint at first, but unmistakable. It wasn't the regular kind of noise you could brush off. No, these were voices, real voices, so close to my ear that I could feel the breath on my neck. They would call my name, softly, sweetly, or with a tinge of desperation. Sometimes I'd wake up to hear it, the whispers barely audible through the fog of sleep. "Daniel, don't leave." By the third week of these nightly disturbances, I realized something I hadn't wanted to accept. I was not going to get better, no matter how many times I tried to ignore it or pretend it was all in my head. I could no longer escape the truth. It wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. I wasn't being paranoid. It was real. Whatever had followed me from Lockwood Tower was still here, and it wasn't going away. The final breaking point came one evening after work. I was sitting in the living room trying to watch TV, but the hum of the air conditioner seemed louder than usual. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed too thick, the darkness pressing in. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and then, just as I stood up to turn on a light, the floorboards creaked under my feet. I turned to the door. There, standing in the dark entryway, was a figure. I could only make out the silhouette, a man in a high-collared suit. His face was obscured in shadow, but I could feel his presence in the room like a weight. And then the words came, soft, but undeniably clear. "You can't run from me, Daniel. You'll never be free." I backed away, my legs giving way beneath me. My pulse raced in my ears and panic flooded my veins. Suddenly, the figure took a step forward. And as he did, I could see him, really see him for the first time. It was Charles Lockwood. His face was pale, gaunt, and twisted. His eyes were wide open, but there was no life in them. His mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, and his neck bent at an impossible angle as he slowly lurched forward. I didn't even think. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was outside, standing in the cold night air, gasping for breath. I don't know how far I went, but I didn't stop until my legs gave out and I collapsed on the sidewalk. The next day I moved out. I packed up my things, took a few clothes, and I left. I didn't look back. I couldn't. It wasn't until weeks later that I found out about the disappearance of my replacement at Lockwood Tower. Her name was Rachel, and she had started working there after I left. She was found missing after her shift on December 17th, exactly a year after I'd had my encounter with Charles Lockwood. There's a part of me that knows deep down, that whatever haunted that building is still out there. And one day, it will find me again. But for now, I'm running.